I just want to welcome everybody here this morning. My name's Amy Scheller. I'm from the University of Minnesota, and we're happy to be here, and we're happy to have all you in this room, and we're happy to have our remote sites. We have about 7 or 8 remote sites out there. We have folks in Bismarck, in Crookston, Minnesota, Devils Lake, Dickinson, Jamestown, Minot, Fergus Falls, Polk County, Minnesota. So welcome to all you guys out there, and also welcome people via webcast. So people are in even more locations at their personal computers watching us via webcast. So welcome to everybody there. I want to make a few announcements to those folks. There's handouts that we have printed out for folks in the room that you can go online and access. The URL's right here. And during our Q&A period, we'll do our best to field a few questions from people who are on webcast and remote. So you can email those to this email address, and we'll do our best to answer a few of those as well. So welcome to Psychological Impacts of Flooding, Resiliency in the Red River Valley. We have a great program today, and I'm excited that you're all here. A few logistics for folks in the room. Bathrooms are out the door around the corner on the left. We'll be taking a break this morning by about 10 o'clock. Coffee will be flowing all morning, so help yourself at any time. And lunch will be promptly at noon. We have a box lunch here in the building to bring into this classroom. A few other items about the folks that are remote. They can only hear us if we're talking into a microphone. So if you have a great question or a great comment during a Q&A period, we have a microphone set up over here. So we'll ask that people stand up, walk to the microphone, and make their comments into the microphone. So that way people who aren't in the room can hear what's going on. And that's all the logistics for the day. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Mark Ellingson, who's going to give a welcome from Red River Resilience and tell us a little bit about why we're here today.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning to everybody. All right. Good morning again, everybody. In my other life, I'm a local United Methodist pastor, so when I'm standing up front with a microphone in front of me in the morning, I have to resist the temptation to lead in prayer and take an offering. So, as Amy said, I do represent, for the purposes here, Red River Resilience, a group that came out of the flood effort in 2009 in the Fargo-Moorhead area. We were originally we had a long name, the Subcommittee for Emotional and Spiritual Well-Being and Mental Health, a subcommittee of the flood fight of Fargo-Moorhead. But as we attempted to help people keep their head above water figuratively, to find their coping skills, to be able to deal with what was going on, as we recommended rest, routine, and relationship to people, we began to come back to the same theme again and again, and it was the theme of resilience. As the pin that you probably have around you someplace says, the ability to bounce back and adapt. And we began to see that no matter what disaster, what hardship that people were dealing with, they needed resilience, that ability to come back. And we got more excited when we began to realize that that was the same ability we needed in day-to-day living, that the stresses and problems of day-to-day life, we need resilience. We constantly have to bounce back and adapt. Let me try to work this out, give you a little illustration of resilience with something that we use sometimes in our little programs that we present from Red River Resilience. I have a couple balls bought with the same money, for the same money, at the same place, at the same time, by the same person, and they have the same goofy SpongeBob SquarePants picture on them. But there is a difference between them. And if we were in a small group and had a lot of time, I'd dialogue with you, what's the difference? And you'd say, one's in my right and one's in my left. And I'd put it over here, and I'd say, no, that's not right. So let me just show you what the difference is. One bounces back and one does not. How many of you have ever felt like that? A little deflated, a little unable to bounce back. And what we have discovered and what we believe in Red River Resilience is that, and what Dr. Kit O'Neill helped research and we found out is really a scientific fact is that, let me ask the question again, what's the difference between the two balls? Nothing. Because they both have the ability. This one just needs some air, needs something to make it be able to bounce back. We believe the same about people. We all have that ability within us to be resilient, to bounce back and adapt to change in difficult circumstances. What we need are the skills, the abilities, sometimes the encouragement and support to do that. And that's what Red River Resilience is about. And that's why we're really excited about this event. We're really grateful. She's probably going to thank a lot of other people. We want to thank Amy and the University of Minnesota for bringing this here. We are very excited about that because they were able to do things we could not, and we are excited to partner with that. And we trust that you will go home a little different than you were. We already know that you are resilient people, that you've helped people become more resilient and bounce back from things. But we hope that you learn some skills and have some things that you gain and learn today that help you to do that better in your day-to-day life or your professional life, to be more resilient and to also help those around you to deal with those things as well. We, again, from Red River Resilience, we welcome you. We're excited to be here. We know by the end of the day you're going to be a little more tired. We hope that you also have a little more resources within you, a little more skills within you to deal with your life. Welcome and enjoy the day.
So you late arrivers in the back, not to draw attention, but you're missing some really important items in your hand, and they're all up in the front. So come on up. Well, we're going to do a little AV switch in a minute, so you'll have a moment to sneak up inconspicuously and grab a bag with the handouts and other goodies in there. So come on up. Whole row in the front up here. So you all have the pleasure of spending the next remainder of the morning with Peter Tian, who's sitting over here. And I just want to do a quick introduction. His bio is in your handout, so you can read about that. But I've had the pleasure of working with Peter on a number of projects surrounding resiliency and disaster mental health and training, and he's a delight to spend a morning with, so I think you will enjoy him and enjoy his stories. He is president of Tian Funeral Home and founder of the International Mass Fatality Center, but most interesting, I think, today you'll find is that he has served as a leadership role in more than 45 major disasters all around the world, including recent earthquakes in Haiti, including Darfur region of Sudan, September 11th, and a whole host of other disasters, including flooding in his home state of Iowa. So I'm sure you'll hear more about all of that. So please help me welcome Peter and give us a minute to switch the AV over.
Good morning. Glad to be here in Fargo, and it's amazing. I was driving around last night how pretty of a town it is. It reminds me a lot of Cedar Rapids, of the people, the sociability of the people. I had a great time, and I'm impressed at how much newness there is in this town, for including this building. So it shows that it's a vibrant community. First time I was in Fargo was in 1997 with the floods that ended up being well known for the Grand Forks flood. I have done disaster work since 1989, but in that year was only the second time I had ever responded to the American Red Cross response to the Red River flood, but I ended up spending out of 3 weeks, I think a day and a half here, and the rest of the time they shipped me off to Bismarck. So really never got a chance to discover much of Fargo. And then I was back, we were trying to figure out earlier, I think it was about 3 years later, you had another big flooding threat. I just remember one night we were on the verge of evacuating the town of Wahpeton. We were down there getting ready to evacuate that town because of possible levee breaks, and then actually rescued a man who was up north towards Grand Forks. And I may talk about that a little bit here because of the impact of how sometimes we get so worked up on responding that we forget about the people we're supposed to be taking care of. but that's a story I'll share within the presentation. As Amy said, I'm president of the International. First of all, I am a funeral director. I own a funeral home in Cedar Rapids, and people say, "Well, wow, that's strange. Why is this guy, a funeral director, and why is he, here talking to us?" And then, so when people automatically assume when we talk International Mass Fatality Center, well, he goes out and just deals with the dead bodies. Well, it's kind of a round-robin journey in life, and not necessarily connected. Yes, I am a funeral director, and that's how I got involved in disaster work, with the first disaster being United Flight 232, way back in July 19 of 1989. How I got into disaster work was kind of a fluke, and perhaps it's something that you'll experience in your life that changed my whole course. In April of 1989, they were looking for a few funeral directors to train to respond to the New Madrid fault line, which is the earthquake fault line along the Mississippi between St. Louis, Memphis, and Nashville. So they gave us all expenses paid, 2-day trip the federal government did to Des Moines, Iowa. Now that's like going to Bismarck. It's not all that much fun. But for some reason, it sounded real exciting back then. So I said, sure, we'll go to all expense paid to Des Moines, Iowa. So we went to this 2-day training and sat through a lot of power pictures of dead bodies and broken bodies. And I don't know, I was really not impressed that much with the training. But it was, we came away, and I probably like when you go to a lot of conferences, you get all this handout, and you get all these nice bags of things, and you get home, and you say, never going to use it in my lifetime. You throw it on the back shelf of the counter and say, sometime I'll get around to looking at it. That was April of 1989. And July 19 of 1989, I get a phone call and said, hey, you took our course in April. And we just had a DC-10 crash in Sioux City, and tag, you're it, get up here to Sioux City. I became one of the coordinators of mortuary operations, United Flight 232. But so that's why I want to encourage you to read all this material when you get home, because you may get that phone call sometime. In Sioux City, my primary focus was care of the families. I created a program up there where only 2 of funeral directors were allowed to meet with all the families of the 112 fatalities, which is an absurd notion, but at that point, airlines never allowed anyone other than airline employees to meet with families. So it was a big change, and that eventually led to the implementation or the adoption of the Federal Aviation Assistance Act of 1996, now that the federal Congress has set clear standards of how families are going to be cared for. So that's how I accidentally got into disaster service. And as Amy said, I've done over 45 major disasters, really around the world anymore. In the early days, it was that as a funeral director or connected with funeral service was hired by Operation Desert Storm to be one of 35 funeral directors hired by the military to respond to the war. We were gearing up, and a lot of people don't realize this, we were gearing up for 4,000 Allied deaths a week. Now, we've just gone over that number a little bit ago after being in Iraq this May, but we were gearing up for 4,000 Allied deaths a week due to nuclear, chemical, and biological agents. And then it was floods in '93, which was big in the Midwest, and a big cemetery washout where we had 1,200 bodies washed out of the graves and scattered over 64,000 acres. And then I was deputy medical examiner, Oklahoma City bombing. After that is when I got really connected with the Red Cross, ended up here in Bismarck and Fargo shortly after joining the Red Cross, and now serve as the senior national spokesperson for the American Red Cross. And so on catastrophic major disasters in the U.S., I deploy and I deal with all the national and international media reporting what's happening in the disaster. So we're getting into a big time of the year with hurricane season. And we're talking about a record amount of hurricanes this year, 10 more than normal, which is going to be extremely devastating, especially and complicated because of the oil leak down in the Gulf Coast area. People say, what do you do in hurricanes? Well, I say if, in a hurricane, you got this big circle, and this northeast corner is the most deadly part of the hurricane. And where that comes ashore is usually where you get the most devastation. My job is to figure out where that's going to come ashore and get there before the hurricane does. And so I take usually the direct hits of those hurricanes. And so we're telling people how to evacuate, how to take care of themselves, help them deal with the resiliency of waiting for these storms and then responding to the storms. And then, if you see these reporters and the storm's hitting and they can't stand up and they're getting knocked down and trees and buildings are crashing down around them, and you say, what stupid idiot does that? That's what I do. So I'm one of those stupid idiots. And then we're there in the aftermath of the storm to deal with helping people pick up the pieces of their lives and help them get started again. So that's, so that's what I'll do in hurricane season. And then on international deployments, which Amy said I've done 3, I led a multinational mental health team to Sri Lanka following the Indonesia tsunami. We created a program to help deliver mental health programs in the internally displaced persons camps, IDP camps, which are different than refugee camp. Refugee camps are where people leave their country and go to another country. IDP camps, internally displaced person camps, are camps that are established for people within their own country. So we developed and delivered a program of psychological training to over 600,000 people living in 300 IDP camps in the country of Sri Lanka. And then in Darfur a couple years ago, if you're familiar with Darfur, Darfur is a region within the country of Sudan, which is in the continent of Africa. And there's a horrific genocide going on over there the last few years. There's been over 250 to 500,000 men, women, and children slaughtered over there in this genocide, and it continues today, though the deaths are not as significant, though the hellish conditions are. So I was brought in by a project funded by Great Britain to develop a psychosocial recovery program for humanitarian aid workers. Aid workers are a lot of times idealistic. They're very talented individuals, very, this frontline work couldn't be done without these a lot of times young staff that come out of college and go over to make a difference, but they're not trained on how to be resilient. They're not trained on how to deal with the horrors of genocides or being attacked. And so I was brought in with my mental health background, which I guess is getting lost in this discussion, but my mental health background to develop a program to train humanitarian aid workers on the front lines of conflict how to deal with the horrors of what they experience. And it used to be as a Red Cross person or other volunteer, other relief agencies, we could go in to areas simply because I've got the Red Cross on. I can go into areas that other people don't want to go into because of the violence, and we will normally be left alone. I've been in some places. The police have taken me up. Here's the area you want to go to. Go on, and they turn around and leave. They say we ain't going in there. But it's typically we were left alone. However, that's changing in the world around us, where now over 78% of humanitarian aid workers in areas of conflict are being attacked. Of the people I was working with in the Darfur region, we had a class of probably, I think we had a class of about 40-some people. And I'd say 90% of them had been victims of violence, either had been carjacked, beaten, held at gunpoint, threatened to be raped, had sat there and watched people get slaughtered in front of them. But no one had ever bothered to teach them how to cope with or how to stay resilient when they're experiencing these issues. So that was a fascinating program to institute that on the front lines under some very horrific conditions. But we now have a full-time program director who lives in the Darfur region, who has continued the program we started a couple years ago. So it's exciting to see that there is hope for these aid workers, because we have to keep the aid workers out there on the front lines because they're the eyewitnesses to the horrific conditions. And that's why they're being attacked and beaten and everything, because the rebels want them to leave so that they can continue on without any witnesses. I know in one class we had, I think it was about 12, 15 of their students were waiting to go to trial for having a party. And they had, it was a holiday, and the gals and the guys and gals of the different aid agencies had gotten together and to have a party to celebrate the holiday. And the police came and dragged them all outside, threatened them with guns, beat many of them, and arrested them for commingling, men and women coming together. And now they were waiting trial to be whether they're going to be deported or not. So it's tough conditions over there. And then Haiti just recently, in January, of course, with a catastrophic earthquake, went over to deal with, as a consultant to a group that took a medical team in, ended up taking over 450 medical personnel in. And that was a whole different ballgame for me, because we were so short of staff and supplies and everything you needed to respond to the horrific conditions there at Port-au-Prince. We ended up working out of General Hospital in Port-au-Prince. And to tell you how bad it got, one night I and two other people were tasked to run a 50-bed critical care unit. Now, how many people have medical backgrounds, either nurses or doctors or whatever? Okay, well, we had a 50-bed critical care unit. We had no electricity. We were in a building that half the building was already structurally collapsed. Our patient load was from newborn twins to elderly people with extensive injuries and on the way out, in comatose. We had people with massive crushed injuries and, big infections. We had limited IV bags, no thermometers, no blood pressure cups. And the three people taking care of them, one was an LPN nurse, the other was a dentist, and the other was a funeral director. So it kind of makes you wonder, if I tell that to my friends who are doctors and nurses, and they say, you got to be kidding. But, it was a funeral director perspective, I saw it as somewhat as a conflict of interest. But it was, the horrific conditions, and again, I'll talk a little bit more of my personal reaction to that event, which was really quite life-changing for me, and as many incidences are in a disaster response. So that's kind of the box that carries a lot of the background that I'll be sharing with you this morning from those experiences, to kind of bring to life what we have. And, from way back in 1989, when no one was talking about psychological impact of disaster response, when nobody knew that we were having responders having life-changing events and committing suicide and breakup of families and alcohol and substance abuse, when nobody, everybody just would tell you to suck it up and go on and do your work, we're finding, we've had an evolution of crisis intervention to help people build their resiliency, both in chronic disasters like your flood or acute disasters, sudden on-impact disasters like the earthquake, that we have to protect our people, that we're serving, and we have to protect the people that are responding, or we have not completed our task of really fulfilling our obligations of taking care of people in time of disaster. The most important basic human need is the need to feel safe. And that's really why we're here today. And that's, for most of us, and I don't know all the backgrounds that are here, but I see law enforcement, we have healthcare and mental health folks here, and I'm sure there's a wide, diverse group here, that we're a caring, usually, professions. And we're there to take care of the people, to make them feel safe. People rely on us in time of disasters to have an effective, efficient disaster response plan that we can implement and get out there and make a difference. And that makes us unique individuals, that we're willing to, at the time of crisis, step forward and help people, and oftentimes at a price of our own, of not only emotionally, but a lot of times we'll move on from our families and go out and help someone else while our families are in great need behind. I remember back in Katrina, a good friend of mine who was head of the Red Cross in the Gulf Coast area in Mississippi had lost her home, her parents' home, had a husband and 4 kids, but she had to go to work every day to take care of that response and take care of other people. And you just sit there in amazement that we will do that because we are such caregivers. That also gives us in a psychological position of opening ourselves up to so much pain that we become like a big sponge, that we absorb a lot of other people's pain and discomfort. And that's what this presentation is really going to be about, is how to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves so we can help others and help others feel safe. When we look at disasters in general, I just say there's different categories here. You have the technological, health, social, and natural disasters. Nuclear accidents, chemical spills, and air crashes are very possible here in North Dakota. I didn't check to see whether you had like a nuclear power plant. Do you have one in North Dakota? We have one outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where I'm from. And people around there say, oh, that's where the big threat is. Well, that's really the minimal threat. You list probably a list of 100 threats for our community. I put the nuclear power plant way down at the bottom because there's so much security around that. Nuclear accidents can be transportation of nuclear products. It can be universities. It can be hospitals that have nuclear products that they use in their research and their studies that a lot of times are unsecure and not well, I don't want to say maintained. There's not the security around them sometimes that there should be. Sometimes you have vehicles driving down the highway. They'll have those products on that can be a hazard. Chemical spills like Iowa, North Dakota is an agricultural community, so you have a lot of risk at chemical release. I know in our flood of 2008, one of our biggest threats was a grain processing company. It was right in the heart of Cedar Rapids. In good days, in good weather, without any floodwaters around it, they said if that thing sprung a leak, that chemical tank sprung a leak, it would kill everybody almost immediately within a 10-block radius of the plant. Well, in the 2008 flood, the whole plant was surrounded by raging waters of over 12 feet high, and the tank was at risk of letting go. And so that is a very realistic threat in communities like ours with agricultural base. And you've got a big airport here and military operations. You don't see a lot of threats of hurricanes, but you probably, like us, had a big threat of tornadoes just recently within the last few days. And we've seen the death tolls that can be generated by tornadoes. Floods, that goes unsaid in this part of the country and in the Midwest with all the floods we're experiencing. Probably not a lot of forest fires here, but you could have range fires going on. Epidemics like the H1N1, contaminated water, dysentery bodies, I would think the washout of cemeteries would be a big threat because probably like in Iowa, a lot of cemeteries are buried near rivers. And it just doesn't take much to wash those cemetery graves out. In fact, in the flood of '93 in Missouri, it was a little town of Hardin, Missouri, the cemetery was 6 miles from the river. And the Missouri River broke through its bank, traveled across open farm fields, and hit this cemetery and just hit it right where it washed out. It was, I think, 150 feet wide, 300 feet long, and 75-foot deep hole that washed that cemetery out. And you can imagine how the community responded when you wake up and find your loved one's casket floating by the house. The bodies were dumped out of the casket, so you had human remains, scattered. Burials all the way back from the early 1900s, late 1800s, up to, I think, the most current was like 2 weeks prior to the cemetery washout. So each of these disasters create different psychological issues, or way different response, or how, can impact how people, see the world. And things that we have to take in consideration. Social issues, of course, are riots, terrorism, and warfare. And we haven't seen a lot of risk of warfare in our country, we've seen acts of terrorism, but not warfare. But I put warfare up there because it has kind of a unique niche in, especially when we look at combat situations that could be dealing with nuclear, chemical, and biological warfare. And it was one of the things that was a big concern with Operation Desert Storm, was someone killed on a battlefield overseas due to nuclear, chemical, biological agents. They will return those remains back to this country. And right now, there is no clear way of disinfecting or decontaminating those remains. And so the risk is, how are you going to contain what that individual was exposed to once it gets back into the general population? And if you remember, when we started this campaign in Iraq, as well as in the 90s, you saw for a few days in the paper the Pentagon was considering cremating the remains before they returned to the families. And about 3 days later, in both cases, they came back and said, no, we're really not thinking about that, because there was such a public uproar of cremating the soldiers before they brought them home. And so there is this risk that is always associated with bringing combatants back from a chemical, biological, and nuclear type combat situation. We do know that regardless of what the disaster is, that anyone who sees it just is untouched by it. Whether it's dramatic one of the World Trade Center explosion to this was our downtown 2 years ago, with 12 feet of water flowing through the downtown area. Our flood was kind of like the Grand Forks flood. It was devastating, took out, I think, 16% of our community. 4,000 homes were lost. Every single government building we had was destroyed. They've now back into the police department. The sheriff's department just got back in a month ago, but the courthouse, county administration building, fire department, federal courthouse, all those buildings are still not up and going yet. So it really cut into the core of the city. Floodwaters, I think 15 blocks away from the river, where before maybe it was, flooded 2 blocks away. So it was quite devastating for us. But, if we different perspective, different types of disasters, but still very powerful disasters that permanently change the lives of people. I mean, Iowa, Cedar Rapids, probably like areas up here, 2 years later, a long ways from recovering from this flood, both economically as well as emotionally. And especially this time of year when the river's rising, we have inundated with rains again. People are, again, this chronic thing of, is it going to happen again? Are we going to lose everything all over again? Some of the tenets that we can talk about in disasters, what are the 2 most important parts of a disaster? And I guess that's a question I want to throw out to you. And that's why in your handout there's no answer filled in there, because I want to get some of your reaction. What do you think are the 2 most important parts of any disaster? Sir, what do you think? Ongoing safety. Preparedness. How about you? Right here. Dealing with the reality. Officer? Duration? Okay. Those are all good answers, but, we need to, and they all are important. I don't want to minimize how important all those answers are. But for the work that we do, and for what we're really trying to focus on here as far as, how do you achieve have a very successful response? It's where your focus really goes. And if we lose focus of these 2 real important aspects of a disaster, our disaster response will fail. I mean, you may get the water back in the river and you may get the building rebuilt, but in essence, your response is going to fail if you don't keep these 2 parts as your top priorities. The one is the victims and the families. And the victims and the families, I mean, we have to be the ones pounding on the table saying, what are we doing for the victims and the families? How are we treating them? Because you're going to have a lot of people coming into your town in a disaster who are going to come with a lot of personal agendas. They're either going to be political agendas, social agendas. Corporations are going to want to take in and buy out, take over this property at cheap prices. In Cedar Rapids, we have a lot of, money grabbers who came in and offered, an eighth of the price of what the property was. And a lot of our elderly people sold their properties at bare bone prices, and now they're flipping the properties around and making a ton of money. And so, we have to be saying, wait a minute, any plan we have, any focus we have, anything that happens in our community, has to be what is in the best interest of our victims and our families. Because if we don't, it's going to get lost real quick. And, I remember, I like telling a story of in Oklahoma City with the bombing there. We were working out of the Family Assistance Center where we were doing death notifications. And the governor came one day and he wanted to see where we were doing death notifications, and then which was up on the second floor of the building, very secured, armed guards at the elevators and gates, elevators and stairways. And if you weren't working up there or a family going up to get a death notification, no one was allowed up there. Anyway, the governor came. He wanted to meet the staff that was working up on that second floor, and so the escort said, sure, you can go up under one condition: there's no family member there. But if a family member comes to get a death notification, you need to leave. And the governor said, sure, I can agree to that. So they sent the governor up under escort to meet the staff on the second floor. As they were going around meeting staff, the governor's cell phone went off. And just about that same time, his escort was notified a family needed to come up to get a death notification. So the escort was told, get the governor to move. Well, the governor's chatting on the phone, and the escort's here. Let's say you're the escort. I'm going to pick on you. That's part of the fun of sitting in the front row. You're the escort. I'm the governor. I'm sitting on the phone. Now you're just a volunteer. No real authority other than what was invested to you by being a volunteer and someone with a great heart and compassion. And you've told me you've got to leave. Now, the governor's talking, the escort comes up and says, Governor, you have to leave. And the governor's sitting there, pauses just a moment on the phone, pauses and tells the escort, just a moment, I'll be right with you. Now, I contend you're the escort. What are you going to do to me? You've got a dilemma. You've got a family coming. And you've got the governor, the boss of the operation, it's his state, that, is telling you just a moment. What are you going to do? Hopefully what you're going to do is come back and say, tap him on and this is what the escort did, was tap him on the shoulder and say, Governor, obviously you didn't hear me, but a family is coming and you need to hang up right now because we need to leave. And the governor paused again on the phone, turned to the escort and said, just a moment, it's an important call, I'll be right with you. Now, most of us, as volunteers, figure we don't have the pay grade to challenge a governor, right? But if we believe in this philosophy that the victims and the families are the most important, then who's going to speak for them if it's not going to be you? And who's going to speak for them if it's not your staff that you're managing, that you're going to empower to speak for them? Because as this interaction was going on between the governor and the escort, other people were around. They were watching this interaction because, we're going to see, how other people will do it and, whether we really believe in this philosophy or not. And I give credit to that escort because that escort said, I believe in the victims, I'm here to protect the victims and the families, not to be the caretaker of this governor. And she turned to the governor and she tapped him on the shoulder and said, Governor, hang up the phone right now or I'll do it for you. The family is coming, we need to leave. And it kind of shocked the governor, as you can imagine. And the governor looked at her looked at his phone, looked at her one more time, and went back to his phone and said, "Mr. President, I will call you back." Well, that's a true story, but it really is a classic example of, it's not the President of the United States, it's not the governor, it's not some movie star that's going to come into your area that's the most important. It is the victims and the families. And if you're not going to stand up for them and fight for them, then who is? And if you're a management person, as soon as you back away and say, okay, well, tell the family. I had in one class I was teaching a couple of weeks ago, they said, well, I would have just told the family to wait and, till the governor was off the phone. I said, then you're telling the family they're not important, and you've just told all your staff that anything goes because the family's secondary, tertiary. So, you really have to believe it and really have to commit to it, because you will be challenged. And that's one of my roles when I'm out on disasters is, I escort out, one day I spent a day with like Gail from the Oprah show, and, I escort celebrities, John Travolta and Kelly and that type of thing. And it's just like, it's really easy to get sucked into the excitement of, oh, this is Gail King, or this is John and Kelly, and, you get sucked into it, and all of a sudden you're stepping on the families, and you say, no. These are the important people. These other folks coming are kind of like window treatment. They're nice to have, but don't mess with my families. And I really, it's kind of like being a mother bear to her cubs. That's really what you become when it comes to protecting the family. So for the victims and the families, we'll see how early it is in the morning, and how quickly you pick this up. If the victims and the families are one of the most important parts, what is the second most important part? See, you're awake. The workers and their families, or the responders and their families. Because quite honestly, if we don't take care of our response force, if we don't take care of them before the disaster occurs through training and education on stress management and giving them how to use the right tools, what they expect when they're going into disaster, if we're not doing that, taking care of them, we're not going to have a workforce. And if in our disaster plans, in our resiliency plans that you're developing, if you don't have a plan for their families, you're not going to have a workforce. Post-Katrina, a few days after Katrina, what did we hear in the news? Police officers are leaving their posts and leaving New Orleans and taking their families. And there was this big outcry, oh, they're leaving their posts, New Orleans needs them. Well, their families needed them. And I'm not certain there's a whole lot of people that could really hold blame when the chaos and the horrendous conditions developed in New Orleans, that if you're a police officer that you say, my children and my wife are going to be out of town because nobody else is watching them. And if you're calling on you want your responders to show up for work, you better figure out who's going to take care of their families. In a drill a few years ago, a top-off drill that was studying the biological attack in Chicago, spread biological agents and testing the medical facilities. And their response, it was a week-long drill. At the end of that drill, they interviewed the medical personnel that were in the exercise. And they said, if this was a real event, how many of you would actually show up to work? What do you think the percentage was? Anybody guess? What do you think over there? How many? A third? That was high. A third was high. About 23% said they'd show up to work. Now, we had faced something similar just a few months ago with the H1N1, and the outbreak, and we're saying how many, if it had gone full blown and really impacted the community, how many of your medical staff would have shown up to the hospital to give care? And what were you going to do with your nursing shortage and your doctor shortage and your shortage of your staff in the kitchens or making the food and doing all the lab work? You know, that becomes critical. But what are we doing to make sure? Because they're going to stay home and take care of their kids. They're going to take care of their spouses, significant others. They're going to take care of their elderly parents. You know, they're going to be afraid that if I'm not vaccinated or if, you know, they're not giving me the right medical, you know, right protective equipment, personal protective equipment, I'm going to bring this home and expose my family. I'm not willing to do that. But that's part of, you know, saying my responders are important. My families aren't taken care of, my responders aren't going to be here. In New York, in Las Vegas, we were doing some training a couple years ago, and the fire department said, we've got this great plan if we ever have an incident here in Vegas. All of our families are going to come to the firehouse. You know, whatever firehouse station we're assigned to, that's where our families are going to come and gather there. And I said, do you really want them in your firehouse if you have an incident going on in Vegas? Don't you think it'd be better to get them out of town? You know, out of harm's way, so that you know someone else is watching to them. They called about a year later and said, yeah, we thought about what you said, and now we've made mutual aid agreements with all the surrounding communities. And so our families are assigned to this community's firehouse, and those families of that firehouse are going to take care of our families. Wow, that's great, because now the firefighters know that in Vegas, they don't have to worry about their families because somebody else is taking care of them for it. So we've got to look at that in our plans and make sure that we're all inclusive. And the fact that some of the numbers we'll be looking at here with the psychological impact of what happens to our workforce has a negative impact also on what happens to our families. And so when you're looking at psychological care of your workers, what is the support programs that you're creating to help the family in general? Both the spouses, significant others, the children, and the in-laws. I created a program a couple years ago for the military called Enduring Families, it was called. And we provided mental health counseling in Iowa to the Iowa National Guard to over 7,000 soldiers, plus their families. But it was interesting, at first the military said, well, just their spouses, but not their girlfriends, or not their significant others. And we say, no, you can't be cutting them out. And then, so we eventually evolved to spouses, significant others, children, and parents. But it was amazing how they became so narrow focused. They just said, well, yeah, you know, they may live together, and she may be the mother of their baby, but they're not married, so we're not going to provide counseling to it. So you got to look at the full package of what you're going to do in delivery. And we know that families of responders may not be out there searching for victims, may not be out there on the recovering the dead or facing the horrific conditions of a disaster, but they're very much part of the disaster, and that's why we've got to take care of them. The gentleman that used to teach with me was the first incident commander of the Oklahoma City bombing. And Jim is dead now, but Jim used to talk about how it was to show up in the scene. You have this collapsing structure, cars on fire, cars blowing up, the dead and the injured, and it was his district, and he was trying to get all coordinated at first. And I said, wow, that's pretty powerful stuff. I said, how does that affect your wife, and how did that affect your relationships? And he said, oh, no problem at all. She's used to me being in fire service, and I was in the Memphis riots, and he just kind of brushed it all off. I said, well, that's I find that interesting. I said, how about the next time we do the training, you bring her with you, and let's do a presentation in the evening with the responders and their families, and you share this story. And so he and his wife came to the next training, and they were sitting up in the table up in the front. There was a microphone between them, and I did the introduction. I said, Jim, tell your story. So he said exactly what he told us in class. And all the time that he was talking, her mouth was dropping, till I swear it was going to hit the table, if not the floor at that point. She had this most incredulous look on her face. And she finally, when it was her time, she looked at him and said, what in the hell are you thinking? And he, get this, gals, he was totally surprised by it. He didn't have a clue what was going on. And he said, what do you mean? He says, do you know what it's like as your wife to have a call from a neighbor and say there's been a bomb go off downtown and the Murrah building's collapsing. I know that's your district. That, you know, there are additional bomb threats going on, the cars are exploding, you know, there could be hundreds of dead, and I know that you're on that scene, and I don't know for more than 12 hours whether you're dead or alive. She says, do you not realize what it's like to see you go to work every day and work that site and come home and not talk to me about it and sit on your computer and type it all up and then you turn your computer off and that was the end of it? And he says, do you know what it's like today? And this was like 3 years after the event, to sit there and watch you stand in our living room, look out the picture window, and stare at the children playing in the streets. And we'll stand there for hours watching the kids play. She said, Jim, you didn't do that until you lost 19 children in that attack. Don't tell me it hasn't affected us. And it was amazing because it was the first time that Jim had actually realized the impact it had on his family. And Jim told me later before he died that that was actually the first time the two of them had ever talked about the Oklahoma City bombing and the impact on the relationship. And so that's why we have to put a focus on the families, because they're paying a terrific price. And time after time, police officers and firefighters and paramedics and other people come and say, oh, I don't ever take this stuff home. You know, I don't want to scare my kids. I don't want to scare my wife. Well, guess what? They're already scared. And what happens when we don't talk about something? It makes it a whole lot worse. Because then my mind, if you're not talking to me, then in my mind, I'm going to create an image, an incident, or a perception of what actually took place. And many times it's far worse than what the reality is. But if you're not going to share and tell me what the reality is, then I have to live with the horrors of what I can create in my mind. There's three aspects of every disaster. The first one is the physical aspect. And the physical is kind of real easy to identify. That's the structural damage. It can be a broken fuselage on the ground, the collapsed building, the funnel cloud, the hurricane images that you see, the pictures of the Grand Forks or Fargo flooding, that type of thing, or Devil's Lake, Spirit Lake, Devil's Lake is rising. You can see that. That's the physical. That's the easy part of a disaster. The emotional part is also an easy way of capturing it, of representing a disaster. And a lot of times, if you're there on the scene, you find and we can either see it in video clips or still photos, the horror on people that's reflected in people's faces, the shock, the numbness. You see people who are so shut down that they're almost motionless, but you see this bottom lip going like 100 miles an hour because their feelings are going to erupt at some point. So that emotional part is something we understand, and it's also what we'll be talking about today is how to minimize the emotional impact of disasters. But I contend that the most powerful part of a disaster and the most impactful part of disaster is the spiritual part, the spirituality of disaster work. Now, I want to be real careful here. I'm not talking about whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, or what your God looks like, or he or she looks like, or the representation. That is your personal part. The spiritual or spirituality part of disaster are those powerful experiences that human beings will go through in a disaster response that are so powerful that they will reach into the most inner core of your being and touch you and change you forever. And it is that piece of disaster response that I contend is where we will lose a lot of workers. We will find a lot of powerful negativity comes out of it because it's so life-changing we don't know what to do with it. And oftentimes because we don't know what to do with it, or no one's given us the tools, the education to understand what's happening to us, or no one will allow us to really open and be honest and talk about it, we internalize it and it just eats us alive and becomes almost self-destructive. Now it can be a very positive growth, but we have to oftentimes help people who maybe don't have really good coping skills to develop this and get it reframed. And when I look back from my disaster work, you know, I just see a lot of rich opportunities for the spiritual work that I do. And I guess that's part of what gets me back into disaster work all the time. But I go back to the very first one, the Sioux City crash in 1989. So I said one or two of us were responsible doing, caring for the 112 families, doing death notifications, gathering information, talking to them, kind of, you know, help be kind of the shoulder for them to share their feelings to. But we also were doing death notifications. And I had the opportunity to do a death notification on the youngest passenger on board that aircraft, who was about 2 years old. And because because of where he was born, they had no dental records, that we had no latent prints. We didn't have fingerprints, we didn't have dental work because he hadn't been to the dentist yet. You know, nothing really that we would use as standard identification processes in that time. And DNA was not really big in 1989. So his mother was told, if you hold on to your baby really tight, he'll be fine. Well, if you remember the impact of 232, you see the plane come down, hits, puts some big fireballs, breaks up as it goes down the runway. And during that process, he was ripped out of the mother's arms, thrown out in the debris of the wreckage, and was destroyed beyond any form of recognition. The mother ended up with cuts and abrasions. So we had to figure out how we were going to do identification. And it was, so I went out to the morgue one day, and we opened up the bag and the disaster pouch, and he had a T-shirt on. It had a horse race design. And I remember cutting out that horse race design and then taking this piece of shirt into a bathroom near the morgue and scrubbing the fluids out of it, the stains out of it, and using a knife, scissors to cut burn marks and other things out of the fabric. Ended up with a little piece of cloth like that. And then going up to where the mother was kept and walking into her room. And I remember she was sitting in a rocking chair in this room in front of a window. And and I'm walking in with a little piece of cloth and saying, "Is this your baby?" You know, and it was, to me, that was a very spiritual moment, a very powerful moment, because here was a woman that was told, if you hold on to your baby, he's going to be fine. And all I'm giving you now is a piece of cloth, because that's all we can do to identify him. And that led me into a real steep depression, because no one told us back in 1989 the psychological impact of disaster response or the spirituality of the work that we do. And for months and months and months, we had nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night with night sweats, screaming, "God help." I would have these dreams constantly of standing in the middle of the runway, his body draped over my arms, screaming at the top of my voice, "God help me, I don't know what to do with him." Now, I was never on the runway with him. That's how my mind perceived it. But that led me in about 3 or 4 years of depression and suicidal thoughts and focus, because I was not manly enough to be able to cope with it. You know, I had all these strange feelings of, these nightmares and things, and didn't know how to process it, because no one ever talked to me. When they did that 2-day all-expense-paid trip to Des Moines, nobody talked about the psychological aspect of it. It was like, just go and suck it up. And so it's, that can be, and we're going to look at some really staggering numbers of how the spiritual part of disaster response can impact our folks. But we want to be clear that a disaster can be stressful and traumatic. That does not mean everyone's going to be traumatized by the event. Because we don't want to be these caregivers that are going out and saying, "Oh, you're traumatized," or "You got PTSD." It's one of the things I'm real frustrated right now about is they've redefined, or under the new manual they've redefined, I guess is the right word, for PTSD, and now almost everybody can have PTSD, I swear. And it used to be you had to wait like 6 months for a good diagnosis, and now we see news reporters and talk show hosts talking, watching a video of something happening in Denver, Colorado, and they say, "Oh, he has PTSD." Well, not necessarily. You know, it depends on what your coping skills are. It depends on how resilient you are. It depends on what your life experiences are, and how you're able to manage it. I say a lot of us have like big garbage cans on our backs. Some other people define it as cesspools, you know, or septic tanks, but I think a big garbage can. And all day long, what we do is throw all of our stressors in the back of the bag behind us in this garbage can because I'm going to deal with it later. And as day after day, week after week, all those stressors add up and build up on us and start weighing us down. And then something will happen, and all of a sudden, and sometimes it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. It can be a very minor thing, and all of a sudden we're knocked to the ground, and we're saying, "My God, what just happened?" You know, and it's because you never dealt with your garbage beforehand. You never dealt with your stressors beforehand. You didn't develop good self-care to make sure that, you know, stress was manageable and minimized in your life. It just built up. But one day it came out and just exploded over some of the smallest things. When we're talking about disaster and disaster response, we've got to be careful that our staffs and ourselves are going into a response well managing our staff, our stress well. And we create techniques how we're taking care of ourselves and encouraging our staffs to take care of themselves. That will help in minimizing the traumatic impact of a disaster, because you're going to have more resources to pull from within yourself to go out and to respond to that incident. When we're doing training, I hear a lot of people making plans for while the disaster happened. You know, like the disasters has happened, now we're day one, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to do afterwards. That's all fine and good and very important. But when it comes to resiliency and when it comes to the psychological impact, you better start doing it now. You need to do in your monthly newsletters, in email blasts or whatever, stress management tips, or, these are different symptoms we'll see in a reaction to stress or reaction to disasters. These are things you need to think of so that when the disaster happens, your folks already have a toolbox knowing how to manage their stress and take care of themselves. Because once it happens, they're going to be so focused on the response, they're not going to listen to some mental health person or crisis intervention person come and say, here's what you need to do. I don't need that right now. Leave me alone. I need to focus on that. So, pre-incident education becomes very critical when we're dealing with disasters. We look at factors that affect the impact of disaster on a population, and of course this is Hurricane Katrina coming to shore. Massive storm, as you see, all the way up in the Midwest is the northern front of that storm, is what type of warning, what the type of disaster, traumatic stimuli, duration, and losses are. Now, in a hurricane, in tornado season, first we get the Weather Channel saying there's a 80%, I think they're coding it now like their number 5 means there's a high chance of, severe weather and tornadic activity for the day. And then we move into watches, and then we get into warnings, and then the sirens go off, and so we have advanced warnings. So psychologically, we're preparing ourselves for it. Even with the flood, we know that the flood water, it's raining hard, we're already crested, it's going to go over the top. You can prepare that. Now we compare that to a terrorist act where it's sudden onset, or even a bus rollover, on the interstate. We have no warning. We have no way to prepare ourselves. So it's this immediate surge that can be real draining. Where if we know ahead of time through warnings, we can kind of embrace ourselves and make it easier. If it's a terrorist act, it's one type of response. The feeling of being betrayed or being hated or attacked is a whole lot different than an act of God when we're looking at the different types of disasters. What is the traumatic stimuli? What's the visual of it? Part of one of the things when we talked about the pandemic is you may have a lot of people dying, But if the public doesn't see the people dying, will it connect with their mind thought? You know, if they're all dying at the hospital or in their homes and they're being carted up and moved out and there's no images of the death, will it be harder to convince the public how massive this impact is? Now in Haiti, we had over 300,000 people killed in the earthquake. The number keeps climbing. When I left there in February, it was 250. Now they just said it's over 300. You know, they were burning the bodies in the street, stacks of bodies in the street when I was there. That's a pretty strong stimuli when you're seeing, you know, of stacks of bodies being burned. In the hospital I was working, which was an interesting situation, kind of on a slope, and it had a center courtyard with the drives around it, all within a big wall. And around the courtyard and around the drives then were smaller buildings. But up at the top of the hill, just around the corner, was the Haitian morgue. And you go up there, and there were piles and piles and piles of dead bodies that were being brought to the hospital. You know, and so the image and, you know, the environment there of, you know, you're trying to take care of the living who are seriously injured, and here's all these dead piled up there. You know, that became a very dramatic image for people to witness. But that made it much more real. You know, we tend to be a real clean society. We want clean images. We want, you know, a very sterile environment. And so we minimize the impact of images that we put out in this country. But down there, you know, they become very vivid and really bring to home what's happening. Now, losses, a lot of times, will, you know, depend on, you have a lot of people dead. What are the age groups of the people? You know, did the tornado just hit a nursing home and kill 100 senior citizens in a, you know, extended care nursing home? That's a tremendous loss, and will be tremendous grief over that. But you take that same tornado and have it hit a daycare where 12 children were killed. You know, it has such a dramatic impact on the community, such a much more intense impact on the responders, that it, you know, so the losses will play significant, the type of losses will play a significant. We also say that in special needs population, if you have it where the special needs folks are killed, you know, because you figure the children in the special needs are defenseless. You know, a lot of people in their mind will say, well, yeah, the nursing home was hit, but, you know, they were the elderly folks, and, you know, they've had their life experience. You kind of just, you know, can process it. But I know in, you know, when you've had like Oklahoma City bombing, you know, 19 kids, that just played, you know, when they got anywhere near those children, it just, you know, the responders just started acting differently. In Sioux City, I think we had 12 kids under the age of 15 killed on that air crash. And, you know, it was, I remember talking to the people working in the morgue, and they said, you know, we work hard when they brought the adults in, and everybody was, you know, moving along doing their job. They said as soon as they brought one child in, the whole place basically just shut down. And the focus was on getting that child out of the morgue, getting him processed, getting him identified, getting him, you know, taken where we could get him back to the next of kin. And that, you know, it just is a very emotionally draining situation when you're dealing with the children. Age plays a big role. Who do you think has the ability to better recover from a disaster? The elderly or the young? How many think the elderly? How many think the young? Typically the elderly. And why do you think the elderly are able to better cope or manage with a disaster response? Life experiences, develop coping skills, that type of. They have something to put it into perspective from. I mean, you look at that. I love this picture. You know, you look at this woman and you say, you know, just the incredible lines on her hands and her faces tells you that she's seen a lot. You know, she's rich in life experiences. You know, it can be difficult for her, and it can be a challenge for her, but at least she can put it into perspective that a lot of times when we're having these disasters and we have a lot of young people, they don't know what to compare it to, you know, and so their lives are more out of control at that point because they don't have, a lot of times, you know, they don't have a religious background to pull from. They don't have something to, you know, maybe, quite honestly, in some cases, maybe failing a test or a class was the worst thing that's happened to their life. Now they've lost, you know, now they've lost their homes or they've lost family members, and it, you know, it's how do we process it? I know in a hurricane a couple years ago, I was taking the president of the American Red Cross around Punta Gorda, Florida, where a hurricane had gone through and destroyed a lot of trailer homes of retirees down there. And we had like 150 elderly folks living on foam mats on the floors in the gymnasium. And so I was taking the president around and going up ahead and say, would you like to meet the president of the Red Cross? And people would get all excited. And there was one woman who was very arthritic, very crippled, you know, who was on this rubber mat. And I went to get the president to bring back to meet this woman. And I saw her pulling up a chair and kind of crawling up on the chair. And you could see it was very painful for her and very difficult for her to get up off this gym floor. So I hurried back and I said, you know, that's all right. You don't need to do that. You know, the president will come and just talk to you right where you're at. And she looked at me and she said, young man. I like that. She said, young man, she said, I may have lost everything in my life. I may not have a home. I may not have clothes or possessions, but I still have my dignity, and I will stand for the president of the Red Cross. You know, I had another woman that was sitting over against a wall on the other side, and we went over and we're talking to her, and he says, well, you know, I understand you lost everything. She said, no, I didn't lose everything. And we said, well, oh, okay, so, you know, what did you lose? What didn't you lose? And she reached in her one pocket and she pulled out a dollar bill and she said, I have a dollar bill in my pocket, so I'm not broke. And she reached in her other pocket and she pulled out a letter. And we said, well, what's the letter about? She says, well, I used to be a pro golfer and taught golf for a living. And he says, this is a letter from one of my students who's now a professional golfer, makes his living by playing golf, and he wrote me a letter to thank me and to tell me that about his family and his kids and their house and how everything he has in life is what I taught him. And so she said, so I have a dollar, so I'm not broke, and I have a letter saying my life was worth something. She says, so I haven't lost everything in life. And so that's the positive things with age and how they're able to pull from coping skills. Now, they can be challenged with health issues that make things, you know, things difficult for them to recover, but they still will, you know, they have a lot of tenacity and a lot of times will want to be taking care of themselves. Economic status is oftentimes a misunderstanding from when we're out in big disasters. People say, well, that's a wealthy part of town, they don't need our help. A lot of times those are some of the people that need our help because they're so maxed out a lot of times beforehand, you know, and living on a high level, income level, they have everything they want. Now the storm has destroyed everything they had, and they don't know how to make things stretch. You know, in post-Katrina, we were working a shelter. We had, one time, I think, 17,000 people living in this shelter. So the space you had was about the size of the table in front of you. That was your cot. That was your space plus what was underneath. That's all. And sometimes people had things. Sometimes they had nothing to put underneath their cot. But you figure 18,000 of you, from the very poor to the homeless to the drug addict to, you know, the banker from down the street, they had the same space in life. And, you know, the people who had nothing before the storm or who were challenged or had challenged, you know, who had difficulty in life before, they just were able to know what to do and kind of function. You know, the people who had lived in those conditions, austere conditions, were having a great difficulty in coping with the impact of the disaster. What's your expectations of self and others? If you expect your community to back you up, to come help, to save you, that's one thing. If you're an ethnic group that feels that you've been pushed away by society, that if they're not going to come help me, we're going to have to do it on our own, that will have a dramatic impact. And especially if you're expecting someone to show up to help you and no one comes. And I think that's going to be part of the threat with an H1N1, is people think we're coming to help. And a lot of people aren't coming. And so, I don't know, how many people here have like stored food in your house to get you through, a few weeks? Stored water so that, when we have a big incident, an H1N1, that, there's not going to be food on the shelves. There's not going to be gas at the gas stations. You're probably not going to have internet. That'll probably go down relatively quick. But who's going to take care of you? You're going to have a large population out there that are going to stand around and say, well, where are we at? And all the hurricanes a couple of years ago in Florida, I think Florida got hit with 7 hurricanes. And it was amazing. Finally, in the last hurricane, Jeb Bush got angry on the radio because it was the day after a hurricane swept through Naples and across by Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And people were complaining the day after the hurricane that they had no food, gas stations were closed, and they were complaining the government wasn't doing enough. He says, my God, folks, this is the 7th hurricane that's hit this state in the last 4 months. Wouldn't you think when you knew a hurricane was coming, you'd go out and buy food just so you can manage more than a day? But the expectation was, you're going to be taken care of. And when the federal government, the state government, county government, and agencies don't show up, it's going to have a tremendous impact on the public's response to that disaster. What's your level of disaster preparedness will have a big impact. How many people here have a disaster plan for your home? Okay, we're kind of disaster planners or responders, professionals. I only saw less than a handful of you raise your hand. When we evacuated, Grand Forks back in '97, I think we had something like 50,000 people in 47 states and 3 U.S. territories afterwards. But people didn't know how to communicate or get back together again. If you have to evacuate Fargo or evacuate your home in this area, how are you going to reach out and touch other people? In Katrina, we had parents in Atlanta and kids in California, and no way to match them up. So simple basic preparedness will allow you to be better prepared and be able to respond. And what's your role in disaster? Are you the responder, or are you the person coming in to respond? Are you watching it happen, or are you part of the victims? Are you the ones that are being injured? And that will play a significant role in how you view that disaster. And of course, these are pictures of Haiti post-disaster, and one of our patients in the hospital on the right here with broken hips and broken legs. It's kind of like, she has very little hope, even with that medical care of the baby on the right, because there's long-term, there's not a lot of promise for her. But it's, the impact on her growing up and the impact of those who survive but are living on the streets are, will be very, very powerful, and how well they weren't prepared. They couldn't anticipate something like that. And, what's a long-term recovery issues for both of these groups of people. I want to show you right before break here a video. As you may know, I think I mentioned earlier, in 2008, the Cedar Rapids flood, we had very little notice. I think we were originally, our flood stage is at 12 feet. The levees are built to 20, and we thought it was going to go to 22 at one point, and then we thought it was going to be 24 feet. And then the skies opened up just north of us and dumped like 9 inches of rain in a very short period of time. And our flood waters at that point we were projecting going up to 34.5 feet. I think stopped at 32.5 feet. but all of our river gauges were gone. No computer models from Weather Service were available because nobody could project that type of devastation. But when we're talking about preparedness, and I know with your VOAD groups here and stuff, you know, and part of the pre-incident education is what are you doing to prepare your groups ahead of time to manage a disaster? I want to show this video about Serve the City because about 6-7 years prior to our flood, we had, I brought together the faith-based community of Cedar Rapids and said, you know, if there's a school violence or if there's a tornado or, you know, something happens to our community, nobody ever imagined that flood ever. I said, we're going to need the faith-based group to respond, you know, and you need to be trained. You just can't show up as a clergy and say, this is what you're going to do. And so for about 6-7 years, we were doing crisis intervention trainings at pastoral meetings, going out and training church members, you know, getting them involved in emergency management meetings, getting the representation so they knew what they were going to do in the time of disaster. What was so valuable to us, and especially Serve the City, especially in the floods of 2008, as it ended up, there was 2 of us in the Emergency Operations Center that had any disaster experience. One was the police chief who had just moved from Florida to Cedar Rapids 2 weeks before the flood, and he had hurricane experience, and I was the other one. Our emergency management director had never, the only thing he knew about disaster is what he'd done at FEMA training. So he's sitting in the front with his books that he got from FEMA class and trying to figure out what to do next. And quite honestly, we were calling for help from the state and from, you know, my connections with Red Cross, and nobody would believe us how bad it was going to get. And yet we knew we were going to start losing our city, and we couldn't get people to pay attention. And so I remember at about 7 o'clock at night, I turned to emergency management director and I said, we need to start evacuating, and we need to do it in the morning. And he says, well, what are you going to do? And I said, we're going to call Serve the City, our faith-based group that we had created. And I said, we're going to start evacuating. By the next morning at 7 o'clock, I think we had 150 pastors and church members meeting in a church, figuring out how we were going to evacuate. Within 3 hours, we had 1,000 people going door to door. And later that afternoon, I think we had 1,500 people going door to door. Not only telling people to evacuate, but helping them move stuff out of their basement, getting their valuable stuff, helping the elderly, people who needed stuff physically moved. We had over 1,500 volunteers going out door to door making that happen in the affected area. And that's why with the devastation of the flood that we had no loss of life. And I really attribute it to the work that we did with the faith-based groups that's now known as Serve the City. So take me just a second to get this connected, but it gives you kind of the background, and I think would be a valuable, if you're not already doing it, would be a valuable part of my role as a volunteer with the American Red Cross is a leadership role to work with emergency management and Emergency Operations Center. When I reflect back to the 45 major disasters I've been around the world, this was probably the second largest flood event that really has significantly hit this country. I became involved with the county on the 7th of June and reached out to Serve the City on the 9th of June because we knew the crisis was looming. We knew we were going to have a flood. Oh, I remember calling Charles up. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening. And I said, Charles, I've been on a lot of disasters in my lifetime. And I said, I'm so tired of waiting until after a disaster occurs before we go out and help people and start saving lives and property. 7:30 the next morning, we met over at L's Community. We had almost 100 some clergy leadership there that said, we can do this.
Because of the fact that Serve the City represents a coalition of 37 churches, Serve the City was able to ramp up a volunteer base from just a few dozen people to, by the end of the week, it mushroomed to about 3,000 as our connections with local media and as our role as really a volunteer coordinator for the community emerged.
Serve the City really played a tremendous role because they established the phone lines, they had the people answering the phones, and they were channeling the information to all the hungry people that wanted to help.
And having followed disasters prior to this, Katrina and the like, it seemed to me that FEMA and the Red Cross had really gotten bogged down doing things that weren't necessarily their role. And I would think, the primary thing that stands out in my mind is coordinating these volunteer efforts. They were able to work, I think, very quickly here, set up camp and function in their truest capacity because Serve the City was there picking up this end of it.
Realizing that our church was in jeopardy, we spent every effort that we could in helping the neighbors retrieve and evacuate whatever things that they had, their precious things. It was 12:15. We were ordered to be out of here by noon. 12:15, we looked at our clock and we just looked at each other and we said, God, thank you. And we walked away.
This is the church where we met.
I
It
had
ended
him,
up
I knew
being
in my
destroyed
gut
that's later.
that we were walking away from a lot. But I didn't know the devastation that would take place. We got a shell.
The police department in the briefing, looking at the maps, made it clear very dramatically that there was no possible way they could get to all of the houses in time to communicate. So their plan at that point was to actually just take cars and do loudspeakers. And they admittedly kept saying, but that is not going to be comprehensive enough. Well, at that point, I spoke up in the briefing and said, well, we can get to the houses simply because we had such great success in time check. What happened is, I believe within 2.5 hours or 3 hours, we had enough volunteers deployed that evening got the fire department paper, every door knocked on, every person talked to see that the evacuation happened.
It now had moved beyond individual homes and what we could do for individual residents to the excitement and the heroism, if you will, of having to supply volunteers to save core infrastructure in our community, to save hospitals, to save water pumps.
With the loss of the homes, with the loss of the infrastructure, with the loss of all the government buildings, we had every decision-making person out of their offices and loss of computers.
At the Emergency Operations Center, you had the police, the fire, the National Guard, the Red Cross. You had all of the vital, the school system, the hospitals. They were all represented, all these vital ingredients to working together in the same room. And we had 3 from Serve the City in that room. So when there was needs and we could supply the answer, somebody in there, they were all working together was awesome.
We came within hours of having no water, no electricity, no sewer. That doesn't get much more catastrophic than that in a major disaster. And without the help of Serve the City, there had been no way the point of distribution's been able to be established. There had been no way to calm the fears of the public at large, because the city had no resources, the county had no resources with manpower. They were already tied up fighting the water. It was indeed a day of valor when Serve the City stepped forth and said, whatever you throw at us, we'll do it.
And I saw men of faith that were trying to really be kind and gentle and respect and love each other, even in the midst of a situation. It'd be very easy to lose your temper It'd be very easy to want to yell at the person next to you. And honestly, I was like, wow.
But some people begin to call us Save the City. But you know, we don't think we really saved the city. We were just being obedient to do our part. When we look at the police and the fire and the National Guard and the people who worked in hospitals, when we look at so many entities around this area, we were all out there serving the city. And those who were volunteers with Serve the City were doing our part, and we did it gladly.
That's where we did get some national attention that other disaster-stricken areas didn't, because the people of Cedar Rapids decided they were going to own this. They weren't sitting around waiting for anybody else to fix it. That was their problem.
We were faithful to go to 535 homes. We were faithful in a little thing. So we were given more. We went to 2,000 to 3,000 homes in addition to the 535. We were faithful to do that.
The national media has left. The waters have receded, but the homes are still destroyed. There are so many businesses, so many homes that are still sitting empty and have had no repair work done because the money's not there. And so there is still a lot of work that needs to be done to rebuild our community. Serve the City, the big need we have had all along, we had no operating budget. We weren't prepared for this. And we just need to have funding to do the work of coming alongside families, coming alongside small businesses to help them rebuild.
I was coming down the hallway one day and seeing a young man who was living at the shelter. His T-shirt on the back, he was walking away from me, said championships are won in the off season. And I just stopped walking. I stood there and I watched him go, and I began to realize that if we had not done what we had done in 1998, 1999 or 2000 with Convoy, or 2002 with Voices of Hope, or even as recent as October of last year with our Operation Serve, where we were out in 5 school districts on 30 campuses, and we were learning to work together and build our relationships and forming trust and understanding each other. If we had not done those things in the off season, we could never have done what we were in the midst of doing.
My hope is that, what we learned through that, we're able to impart to other communities. Should something like this hit, and maybe they'll have some of those questions answered ahead of time, but, like I was saying, next flood, we're going to be amazing at this.
We know from experience and other disasters that people will not voluntarily leave their homes. Oftentimes they need to be asked one-on-one, they need to be coaxed out. People take great pride in the fact that people's lives were not lost in this storm. I contend that one of the biggest reasons lives were not lost was because of what the partnership between Serve the City and Lynn County and Cedar Rapids of going door to door, telling people your lives are at risk, your property is important, but your life is more important. Let us help you leave your home and take you to safety. Some social factors that are involved in the impact of it on the population by a disaster is we look at social solidarity, whether the primary groups are intact or separated. And when I mentioned Grand Forks earlier, when they had evacuated Grand Forks or we evacuated Cedar Rapids, or even when we go like now in hurricane season, 1 million plus people evacuating their homes. That really has an impact on their support system. We tend to be people of habit. We want to go to Starbucks every morning, and we know the gal that's making your Starbucks. She sees you pull up and she gives you your coffee. You don't even have to order it anymore. You go to work and you go on a smoking break, or you go to lunch with folks, or you go to church with folks. We have our various support groups. All that comes into play. Well, you disrupt all that, and that really throws people into a real spin because they don't have their network of supporters or people to work with or that they can rely on to get into a routine. In a sense, that's why in a disaster, one of the first things following a disaster they try to do is, if school's in session, is to get the schools back up and going. So we get the kids into a routine. Plus, it gets the kids out of harm's way, and the parents can focus on the relief. But it's really to help start establishing routines. When I mentioned the shelter, for instance, and where we had the 17,000 at one time, it was fascinating. You had two big arenas separated by a center core building. But you could stand up in the balcony and watch down on where all the cots were. And it was fascinating to sit there and watch as people started creating their own social groups. All of a sudden you saw people moving their possessions from this cot over to here, and then you realize, well, those are the young moms with babes. And then you saw the elderly guys kind of put their things together, and they kind of went over there and created kind of the old guys' corner. And you saw families, coming together with families, and you started watching them start babysitting and caring for you. You go get your shower, you go do this, I'll watch your kids. And so they were creating their own social structure, trying to get some routine going, even in the worst conditions you could think of. They were working hard to get it established. And that's why when we're establishing a shelter operation, when you open up a shelter, one of the first things you start doing is figuring out how you're going to shut it down, because you don't want people creating that as being a home, because then they become settled in there. You want them to start moving on and making plans to go elsewhere to get into a normal, healthy environment when that opportunity presents itself. But when we're doing the shelters, we're also making sure that we're not changing shelters or moving them about just for the sake of doing it. You really want to have a good, valid reason, because as people get their little busy work and get their network set up, if you come in right away and then disrupt them and move them to another building, another location, it just creates a higher level of stress as they struggle with, trying to create some type of support group or community that they can live in. The effectiveness of a disaster response and the characteristic healing event also plays a major role in the social impact of a disaster. And the effectiveness really comes down to how well you were trained beforehand, what kind of communication you had with the folks, and how well your responders did, and what kind of response you received from various, the government agencies, not only in the short term, but in the long term, because disaster response will be really judged by the long-term impact of the disaster. Part of what we'll be talking about in a little while is making sure that you create very strong communication network with the affected population. One of the things I notice in disasters is that you have the command people and the elected officials, they're making all the decisions and they have all the information. They're not so willing to share that information to the public at large. They'll give out a sit-rep report, situation report, and they'll do a press conference or something. But they're very hesitant to go face-to-face with the public. And as caregivers, and knowing that the families are the most important, we really have to push that issue and create an environment where we can bring the people with the information face-to-face with the people who need to know. Following the floods, I went to the city and the county and said, we need to have town hall meetings. And they looked like I was nuts. We're not going to do that. I said, yeah, you are. You're going to go out and you're going to go face-to-face with all these people who lost their homes. And you're going to tell them what's going on, what you're doing, and what are the plans going. And they said, they'll eat us alive. I said, maybe. But they're the ones who need to know. And so our town, probably like your town, is kind of divided into neighborhoods, the Time Check area and the Czech Village area, and the, every little area has a little name attached to it. And so we had meetings for those various neighborhoods. In some meetings, we had over 2,000 residents show up. And probably one of the most intimidating meetings was at a gymnasium or an auditorium at one of the high schools. And you had all these chairs and auditorium seating ahead of us. And you had a stage behind us. And we were kind of in the well between the seats and the stage, the government officials, and I was moderating all the town hall meetings. And so no matter where you turn, you were surrounded by these things. And it was, the elected officials were saying, oh my God, we can't do this. And what we did was, in the town hall format, typically you bring in like 5 or 6 of the top-level people who are making decisions or knowing. That can be like your incident commander. It was our public health officer, from the Department of Public Health, maybe the police chief or the mayor or something. And you say, you got 10 minutes. Tell these folks what's going on from your perspective, 10 minutes. And so you'd have like 5, 6 speakers who would talk 10 minutes each. And then you open up to questions. And once we got the elected officials through like their first meeting, they said, wow, this is really cool. And then we had many, many of them around the cities for several weeks. And then it stopped for a long time. And then just this past December, we started them up again. Now, I contend we should have been doing them all the way along. But so we started them up again in December. That is probably the thing that families have noted the most as far as a healing environment, is that people were willing to talk to them and tell them what's going on. And what it did was increase the information disbursement, but it also decreased the stress of somebody's up there making a decision about my life and not even asking me about it, or not even letting me know what's happening. And that's why when we're saying the victims and families are always got to be number one, that means they need to get the information first. I'm not a big fan of a reporter telling the families who have lost all their homes what the city's going to do about flood recovery or buying out houses or stuff before we've told the families. And that's where we push for these town hall meetings again. You're doing buyouts, then you get the people who own the homes to come to this meeting and you tell them face to face before you go tell a reporter that's telling everybody else. They deserve that knowledge first. And so town hall meetings prove very, very effective in communicating and demonstrating to the people affected by the disaster that you are working with them. You are giving control and the power and the information back to them to help them decide what their life is going to look like, and that's going to dramatically increase the ability for them to heal and for your community to heal. When we look at opposite poles of we have all the information, you're over there, we're not going to come in contact with each other, then it's going to be, create a very antagonistic environment, which will affect the long-term recovery aspects of a disaster. Considerations for pre-disaster conditions that we have to look at is healthcare needs of pre-existing mental health conditions. How strong are your mental health providers? How strong is your public health department or your home care agencies in your communities? Are they involved in meetings with emergency management? Public health seems to has just in the last few years, with encouragement from the federal government, have really been sitting more and more at the table of emergency operations center emergency planning. That's not always true. Hospitals have getting involved. That was not always true. But are you sitting at the table like they said and serve the city, and being a vocal member of what's happening? Because it is the healthcare and it's the mental health groups that are going to be the advocates for the families. And if you're not sitting at the table, the families don't have a viable advocates saying they're arguing for their protection. I remember after the Northridge earthquake, Diane Myers, who has probably written a huge percentage of disaster mental health books and manuals, both for the government, and she has several private books out. She's a personal friend of mine, as well as is one of our instruction staff for the Mass Fatality Center. But she talks about, after Northridge, which they had, the big shelter was at the convention center. And a lot of people without homes, had no place to go, really the government was really struggling to find them alternative living. Well, a car show was coming to that community, and the car show wasn't going to cancel, and they needed the convention center. And so they were going to make all these residents leave the convention center so the car show could come. And we're trying, the thing they came up with is they had an aircraft carrier in the bay, and they were going to move the women and the children out on the aircraft carrier, and then put the men, the husbands and the men of the groups, find some congregate shelter and put them in a shelter. They weren't going to let the men live on the aircraft carrier with the women and the children. And Diane's, you got to be creative, and she's a really talented woman. She was sitting there and trying to listening to this absurd thing of breaking up families after a disaster. And she said, I don't think this is a good idea. And she says, in fact, in a book about disaster mental health, an expert, Diane Myers, wrote this. And they said, well, if it's in a book, then we've got to do it. And they never made the connection. It was she that wrote the book. But she said it was the greatest satisfaction because they didn't connect that I was the author of the book. I just said in this book, this is what you're supposed to do, so they went ahead and did it. And so sometimes when you're sitting in meetings, you just have to be creative how you're getting your point across. Other issues come in is, what is a homeless or marginally housed population? Now in Cedar Rapids, we lost the vast majority of our homeless shelters. And so now we had the homeless and marginally housed that had no alternative shelters to go to, and it took us months to get them to get those reestablished. So what are you going to do with them, and how are you going to get them involved, and how are you going to address their needs, both physical and mental health needs, and quite honestly, how are you going to get them evacuated from the area, and where are you going to move them to? Single-parent households. If you got a young mom, for instance, with a bunch of kids, who has very limited resources, who's going to help her evacuate her house, put her in a shelter, give her what she needs so that she has the support? People living in poverty, and this is all these issues, and the single-parent household, homeless, and particularly the living in poverty, was one of the key things that we saw post Katrina, or actually around Katrina. As nightmarish as the event was post-Katrina, I was in New Orleans the day Katrina hit. I pulled out late in the storm, but it was amazing because we estimated before Katrina hit that we had like 70,000, 80,000 people left in New Orleans, many of them with no ways to get out of New Orleans. And it was amazing, a smaller percentage, of course, but a significant percentage had never left New Orleans in their life. They were elderly folks and never left the town of New Orleans. They didn't really know what was out there. But here we had a catastrophic storm coming at us that we knew was going to cause significant loss of life and injury. And telling people, the mayor of New Orleans did not do his job. Because he wouldn't call for a mandatory evacuation of New Orleans. They really didn't have a plan on how to evacuate people from New Orleans. And I remember the storm hit Wednesday afternoon. On Tuesday night, I was listening to him on the radio and say, well, I don't know if I have the legal right to call for a mandatory evacuation, so I'm going to meet with my lawyers in the morning and we'll make that decision. Well, you had 70,000 people, and your storm hit around 4 in the afternoon. He's going to meet with his lawyers the next morning. It's saying we're not having the families here at a top priority at that level. I got in trouble from the mayor on 10 o'clock, 10:20 that morning because I was on MSNBC doing a national broadcast, and by the time I was done, both the producer and the reporter were in tears. But I said, this is not a case of whether you're staying home or, today to protect your property. This is a case of whether you're going to live or die. And if you don't leave New Orleans now, you know, there's a great chance you will die today. You need to get out of New Orleans. And within minutes, I got a call from the headquarters, and they had gotten a complaint that I had overstepped my bounds, telling people to evacuate New Orleans, because the mayor still had not done that at that point. He didn't do it for almost an hour later. And I said, you know, I believe the victims and families were a top priority. They needed to be told to leave by someone. And hopefully we saved some lives that day. But from there, I went over to the Superdome, and that was one of the most unconscionable things I'd ever witnessed, especially here in the United States, where here we had this big dome. Now, the Superdome was, the government officials in that city had been told for years by FEMA and by Red Cross, do not use the Superdome, because if we lose New Orleans, there's no way we're going to be able to get to the Superdome. You know, we need to get people out, and yet they were hurting these folks in there, and they were going through these magnometers and, you know, checking for, you know, weapons or metals and things. And so you're over there and you're saying, I was standing there, I said, where's the food and water for these folks? And I'm being told, you know, they were told to bring their own food and water. Now I'm standing there, and as they're bringing people in, and next to me is a wheelchair, and the wheelchair is this elderly woman, probably in her 90s, probably a full dementia, curvature of the spine, you know, just kind of plopped in a wheelchair with a name tag around her neck. And somebody had just pushed her in the arena, and that's what a lot of folks, family members did. They bring their elderly or these special needs or people, and they just drop them off, and then they take off and go somewhere else because they didn't want to contend with it. And I look at this woman who didn't have a clue who she was, let alone what was happening. I looked at the government officials, and I said, where the hell is her food and water? And they said they were told to bring it. Now, when you're looking at homeless, marginally, single-parent folks in poverty, this was the end of August. In a community that's high in poverty, who, for the most people, were probably out of food stamps, who had no food left on their shelf, who were waiting until the first of the month to get more government assistance, in a town where there were no grocery stores because all those people left town. And you're telling them, we're putting you in this very dangerous place, and you're bringing your food and water. And, you know, that's a pre-disaster condition that made what happened in the Superdome and what made what happened in the aftermath of Katrina in New Orleans that much more catastrophic, because it was the people who had the least amount of resources that we were trapping in an environment that they had no way out. And, you know, yes, the death toll was staggering, but the death toll could have been much, much higher. And to go back into New Orleans after, you know, I pulled out, I was ordered out by my office to get out because we knew we were going to leave New Orleans. And so I made a dash for Biloxi, Mississippi, which is 78 miles away, but because it was in the storm, it took me 7.5 hours to get there. And then we ended up taking the direct hit in Biloxi. Because, you know, they had the water, but a lot of damage was Pass Christian, Gulfport, and Biloxi. So I don't know if I was any safer there. But the point was that, you know, here, you know, we take the most disadvantaged people and try to put a burden on them that, you know, instead of taking the responsibility for it. We were in Galveston last year, evacuating Galveston. If you remember Galveston with the hurricane, it was Hurricane Ike, I think, coming into Galveston. The Homeland Security Director and the governor and everybody was on TV saying, if you're on Galveston, you will certainly die. Because it was going to, they figured, take over the entire island, and we had the big hurricane several years ago, back in the early 1900s, where thousands died. But they said, if you stay on this island, you're going to die. Well, so they did this massive evacuation, and we brought in charter buses, and we're getting people on buses and getting them shipped off the island somewhere else within Texas and areas. But one of the things I noticed, we didn't have a lot of special needs population people going out of these buses. And I remember as the last buses were getting ready to go out, I went up to the gal representing the mayor's office, was coordinating. I said, where's your special needs population? And she says, well, we're hoping family members took them off. We really don't have a good plan to evacuate them. And I said, how many people do you think have special needs or live on this island? She says about 6,000. And I said, so what you're telling me is potential we have 6,000 special needs people left on this island, and you're telling me everybody who stays on this island is going to die. And, says we can only do what we can do. That's unacceptable. Fortunately, we had no deaths in that storm, but that's unacceptable. I remember I made went out and did a last sweep of an island. I was on the far end of the island, and you travel through these towns, it's like going through a ghost town. But here is this elderly black man, walking down the street, dragging a suitcase on a roller, trying to get to where the buses were evacuated because he had no transportation. No, he hadn't gotten a ride. He was like, he was on the opposite end of the island. It would have taken him an hour in the best conditions to get to where we were evacuating. And the last bus was leaving. I said, I threw him in the car, got a suitcase in the car, got him on. By the time we got him on the bus, the last bus left the island. And I'm thinking, here's an elderly guy that by the time he had gotten there, nobody would have been left. Because you've got to be sure you're sweeping the communities. And when we're in evacuated areas, it's amazing as you're driving along, here are the people with special needs. You're in a ghost town, and here are the people with special needs riding their bicycles, looking around, trying to figure out where everybody at, because they were left behind. So we have to look at, how we create a system to make sure those people who really need us aren't left behind. Consideration for older adults, especially, they have good coping skills because of life experience, but they do have, as we mentioned earlier, diminished physical and cognitive abilities. They really fear their loss of independence, and so a lot of times they won't come out to ask for help. They won't make their needs available because they're afraid that you're going to force them to evacuate and then put them in a nursing home. They're really on limited income, and they're really fearing the loss of income because maybe if the disaster, there's a loss of a spouse or significant other, they lose their Social Security check or their VA check, and makes their living conditions. And they're very reluctant to do the handouts. And they won't speak up on their behalf. And they'll just, like the people, elderly folks I mentioned in the gymnasium, they'll just, I'm fine, I haven't lost anything, I got this dollar in this letter. Yeah, but you've got these other issues to take care of. A lot of times they'll express intense grief over irreplaceable possessions, and a lot of times it can be simple as family photos or things that that they've held on to, or their wedding dress or something that they've held on to that gives their continuity. But this group becomes a real challenge, not in a negative way, but we really have to focus on how we get attention to them and get them to respond and know that we're going to be advocating for them and not stripping them of their pride of their independence. Cultural groups, I don't know what your immigration, your population here is in North Dakota with undocumented individuals, but immigration status is playing a bigger role in disasters. We have people that when we're having a disaster, they will run from government agencies because they don't want to be caught. They think if they turn in and ask for assistance from Red Cross, they're going to be arrested. And so you really have to seek them out. Now, one hurricane, what was the big hurricane that went through Homestead? I'm blank right now, several years. Andrew. When Hurricane Andrew went through the southern part of Florida several years ago, they had a large group of undocumented individuals down there, and they ended up sending the National Guard out into the wetlands and the areas trying to find them because they were going deeper and deeper, going for protection. And they finally had to get them without uniforms to go out because they were afraid the military was going to arrest them. But also they can be easily manipulated. This population can be easily manipulated because a lot of times they don't have a strong use of our language. They don't know our traditions, our cultures. They don't know what to expect post a disaster, and so they're living off of what they expected from when they lived at home. And they're also can be manipulated very well because there's some very evil people out there who will take advantage of these people while they treat them almost like slaves. And following Andrew, one of my friends was with the National Guard, was down there trying to take, getting baby food and things out. And the people who were controlling their population, their groups down there, talked the illegals not to accept baby food because it was what they convinced them was what was in baby food jars was ground up babies, and that's why the picture of the baby was on the front of the jar. And so you had these young parents and things who would not accept any type of food or existence for their babies because they weren't going to feed their babies ground up babies. I mean, it's hard for us to perceive, but that's how people will manipulate and control other individuals for their own good. Some of the cultural things here, even in Haiti, one of the challenges I had with one of my patients of the critical care unit, he had a massive crushed injury, and I needed to get him out onto the military ship out in the harbor, but he didn't want to go because he was in Haiti and in many other countries. Your family has to be in the hospital with you to be really taken care of. They're really your main caregivers. And so if you need to go to the restroom, your family has to help you. And in Haiti, if you want to be fed, they've got to bring food to you. In General Hospital, we were told the hospital had not fed patients in more than 5 years. They relied on family members bringing the food. And so part of the obstacles we had in trying to get people out to the Navy ship, the hospital ship, was here we had this young man, crushed injuries. I told him, you're going to die if you stay here. And he wouldn't leave unless his father could go with him. And I said, he can't go with you. You have to go. And we had, they were tears, and we were all in tears. Because I said, we have no resources here. I mean, they were doing amputations using anesthesia from veterinary clinics. We had no clean water. We had no betadine. We had no electricity. They were doing abdominal surgery one day on an 8-year-old girl with severe abdominal injuries with no electricity because we lost our electricity. And then they do these amputations, and then they give them Tylenol for pain because that's all you had. And this guy was severe enough that I said, you're going to die with the infections if we don't get you out to that ship. Finally, it dawned on me what was happening. He realized that if he went out to the ship, his dad wouldn't go with him. And then who was going to take care of him? Because he couldn't take care of himself. And so understanding their culture, their traditions, we had to explain to them American healthcare. No, you'll have nurses out there. You'll have aides out there. You'll have, you'll be able to talk to your dad by phone, but you'll be fed. You'll be cared for. And then we were able to make the transition, and we were able to get him out in the ship. But he was so terrified that without a family member, no one would take care of him. And so as we're looking at disaster, we've got to see where they're coming from and stop imposing our judgment of where we're coming from and how we're going to provide service to them. Family and gender roles. When we're trying to communicate with individuals of another culture with language barriers, that's why it's so critical that we have a language base or have a group when we're talking about our VOAG groups of where are we going to get all the language resources. And calling up on a phone, I know that's a great resource for hospitals. They can call a center and get somebody to translate for them. Is oftentimes won't work in a disaster. You got a university base here. You got universities around here. How many languages are spoken in those? Maybe tap into those students that can come in and help you. But if, we tend to go to the least resistance. If we're into a population where English is a very difficult language and the teenager speaks English, we'll talk to the teenager to translate. Well, oftentimes that insults the elders of that family and violates their whole family traditions and demeans the elderly and puts them into a lower level of disrespect. We have to figure out how to work within their system, not make them work in our system, especially in the time of disaster, and especially if we believe they're the most important. So it's important to know how literate they are and be sure that our brochures are written. I don't know how many languages are written or spoken here in Fargo, especially with the college. There's probably a lot. But what do? We make all of our brochures in English and Spanish. You know, there's a huge other population out there that doesn't speak either one. So how are you making your brochures? Or are you making your brochures with icons or images rather than words? And, how are you going to allow those people to come together? In disaster, we run into a lot of shattered assumption, the assumption of invulnerability. You know, that's especially true following a terrorist act. The world is meaningful and just. It's hard to think it's meaningful and just when you've just lost a daycare full of kids. You know, it just kind of violates a lot of our own principles and our positive self-perceptions that, you know, especially our responders, that, you know, I thought we had trained our people better. I thought I was better prepared. I thought our hospital was better prepared. You know, obviously we failed our community. You know, I still struggle personally with the floods of 2008. And it's amazing how insidious that gets sometimes. I was at Rotary a few weeks ago. And it was, the speaker up there was a businessman who lost his business and was just now back into his place of business after 2 years. Someone in the audience says, weren't you upset that you didn't get a bigger warning about the flood so you could have done more to save your possessions? And that just struck me really hard. I choked up actually as I was trying to answer, you know, and saying, we didn't know how bad this was going to be because we had no computer models. We lost all of our river gauges. We knew it was going to be bad, but that 9-inch rainfall really threw us over the top. I said, you know, I called for the evacuation of the city. I said, the fact that we didn't lose a single life is something we need to grab a hold of in this community. And yeah, I would have loved to given you, and the emergency management would have loved to given you another warning. But even when the floods were coming and we had served the city going out door to door, people still weren't listening to us. I said, we really couldn't do more, as much as you would like to have done more. You know, and it's a whole positive self-perception. You know, yeah, it's your town. You wanted to do more. You wish you could. It was just totally out of our hands, and we did as much as we could. And that's part of what, you know, in the aftermath of disasters you deal with. Disaster losses, there's a whole list of what people consider a loss. And so you have the loss of life, which is always the top and the paramount. But for many, it's a loss of safety, predictability, the control of, you know, a sense of what their future's like. What's going to hold in the future when you've lost your house, you've lost your business, you've lost a family member? How do you pick up the pieces and move on? But sometimes it is simple things like a rose garden in front of your house. Because, you know, your grandpa raised those roses and your dad raised them, and now they turn them over to you and you've lost them. Or it's the third or fourth generation in this family home, and it was you were entrusted with the home and you've lost it. You know, and so we're all, you know, we all have what's important to us, and what's important to me may not be important to you because of our life experiences, our relationship to the environment. You know, every time it floods in Grand Forks and Fargo and Cedar Rapids, you know, even every time it rains, you're thinking, my God, is it going to flood now? And every time you hear a tornado warning, if your house was hit by a tornado, you know, you're going to be probably afraid, your kids will be afraid it's going to be struck again. So, but it is even a non-weather type environment. It is what you're used to. If you're a police officer and you go to fire your weapon and your weapon misfires, that's your environment. That environment of that weapon is giving you your safety. You know, what will it take to trust that weapon again when someone's shooting at you or your life is being threatened? I'm a pilot. I have an airplane. I flew up in my personal airplane yesterday. You know, I was 9,500 feet over St. Louis back in 1993 when my engine suffered catastrophic engine failure and became a glider. It gets really quiet up there at 9,500 feet when your engine doesn't work anymore. You know, we were able to glide it down, take it about 10 miles, put it at an airport with no damage to the aircraft. But as a pilot, my environment was my airplane. It took me 3-4 years before I had confidence in my plane again. And so it's, you know, relationship to environment is a very broad sweeping. And what's your basic assumptions of the world, which we kind of alluded to earlier. But it's amazing when we evacuate communities. I remember, especially in hurricane operations, if you're evacuating, if I tell you you need to evacuate your home, and you need to do it in an hour, you know, what are you going to grab? What's really important to you? And so people will scramble around and they'll pick the weirdest things sometimes, at least it appears that way. You know, it's like, you know, why do you need the coffee pot? You know, that's maybe important, but in the scale of things, coffee pots usually aren't a top priority. But I've seen people grab coffee pots. But they'll grab their things, they'll throw it in a car, and off they go. But then when we're out when we're out in this heavy traffic and you're not going anywhere, and you know, escaping out of Katrina, we were bumper to bumper traffic, massive storm, and then you watch, you know, people's cars are filled to the brim, and they got all the kids and everybody inside, and you'd see a car break down. Now there's no tow trucks, there's no repair stations, you're in the middle of a storm, and you see these people who have picked their most important things out, and they get out of the car and they basically push their car into the ditch to get it out of the roadway. And then they go in and figure out, okay, what is it I need out of this car? And now you see them standing there on the side of the road with their 3 kids, armful of important things. And it's like the little video where the girl pulled the little toy out of a pile of rubbish, and you know, that was her important things. And then a car stops and picks them up. But there's no room for their things. And so now they got to discard more things and really decide what's important before they get in that car and hopefully make it out to safety. And so when you're facing disaster and when you're facing these horrific situations, you really end up deciding what's really important in your life. And, you know, and that will be a long-term loss to you and your perception of and assumptions of the world. So what I wanted you to do now, and even on the distant sites, I want you each to take a piece of paper. You have just a piece of paper. I would like you to tear a piece of paper up into 10 pieces. The piece of paper is, if I have extra paper, if somebody doesn't have paper, we can probably get you paper from someone else. Tear the piece of paper up into 10 pieces. Now, you're only going to put a word on the piece of paper, so that you don't need big pieces of paper, just 10 pieces. Anybody else need paper that doesn't have paper? You need paper? Okay. See, they got paper right here. And it's always fun, is from my perspective, to sit up here and watch, because, you know, some folks are neatly, she's sitting there neatly folding it over, and it's fascinating. She's creasing it and making sure she's got sharp edges. They're all going to end up being perfectly the exact same size of paper. Now this gal over here is just ripping. You know, she doesn't care if they're identical. She just needs 10 pieces of paper. And then there's always going to be the shock person, like the person in the back there, that just realized they ended up with, you know, with 12 pieces of paper instead of 10, and they don't know what to do with those other 2. You can just discard those. So it's fascinating how tedious we are on this stuff. While you're doing this, while you're doing the big job of tearing up a piece of papers, the next part of this task is I want you to think of the 10 most important things in your life. The things are philosophies, beliefs, whatever it is, what you think is the 10 items or thoughts that are the most important that you don't want to live life without. Now, it can be people, it can be God, it can be, you know, my pet poodle, Charlie, it can be, you know, if I'm saying right now you have to take, you know, you have to, you know, be secured 10 important things in your life because you're leaving right away. What are those 10 things in life that you don't want to live your life without? I want you to put one item on each one of those pieces of paper. Yes? You can put family on there, that's fine. You can clump them all together. You can, if you have 10 kids, you can put 10 kids there. If you have 10 boyfriends, you know, you can put 10 boyfriends there, whatever you want. That's, now, no one's going to see this other than you. So you don't have to worry about, oh, I don't want anybody to know what I'm thinking. No one's going to see these other than you. So you just, one per paper. And no fair asking the person sitting next to you for answers, because these are your 10 things. Be photo albums. It could be, in the floods of Cedar Rapids, we had one person call up because they had left their house, and in the haste of leaving their house, they realized they left the cremation urn with their little daughter, who had just died 4 months earlier, sitting on the mantle of the fireplace. And they wanted us to go into the building and get it. Well, there's no way, that you could do that. But, so, that was something that was very important to them that I don't think they ever recovered. But, so it's like, it's that kind of stuff. What is it that's really important that you want always to be with you? Beliefs, items, family members, photo books. And it's tough to do this. I mean, it's people say, I've only got 6. I don't know. I had one guy only had 2, and he said, I don't have anything else important in life. So it's different your perspective. How many still need time? We got a couple, okay. So when you're done here, what I'd like you to do is turn these face down in front of you, and you kind of mix them up because there's no particular order to them. I don't want you to see what you have on the paper. That's why they're face down, and you can mix them up or just in front of you. You're the only one that's going to see these. A couple left here to finish. Everybody done now? You're done? You're still working? Okay. All right. Now that they're face down in front of you, well, I need your cooperation here. I need you to reach over to the person to your right. So you're going to come this way, and since you don't have anybody, you can't go any further, of course. But so reach over to the person on your right. Without looking at their pieces of paper, take 2 of them. Crunch them up in your hand and throw them on the floor. Actually, what you could do is you could run down to hers and take hers away. They'll give you some satisfaction. Because no one's taking yours, right? Huh?
I said I'm not going to throw them on the floor.
Yes. Why are we throwing them? Why do you have to throw them on the floor? Now you got to pick them up after this is. I'll explain why we're throwing them on the floor. What has just occurred to you is the impact of a disaster. And so a disaster has entered your life, and a disaster by its nature doesn't care what's important to you. It's a random thing. It's not being selective. But when families have a disaster happen, so often they'll look and the most important thing is sitting out in the street or is blown away to a neighbor. And so you're saying, wait a minute, that's important to me. And, the disaster says, doesn't matter. This is no longer worth it. And so that's why we throw it on the floor, because these things are being taken away from you by one issue or another. Now what's going to happen is, because these things go on and for weeks and months, but this disaster just happened, now I want you to reach over to the person on the left and take 2 of their items away and throw them on the floor without looking at them. On the floor there. On the floor. See? She'll do anything not to go on the floor. You got to be on the floor. Because it shows a lack of, those will no longer have value other than to you. Now, when a disaster happens, again, you have the initial impact. Oftentimes, in the early days, you see more and more losses occurring because you thought you'd be able to salvage something and it didn't happen. Maybe another storm came along. Maybe, your car broke down on the highway and you just, you had to make that decision. I can't take this with me in the shelter, or I can't take this into the hotel room, so I got to get rid of it, whatever. So that's why we've lost the second phase. Now, oftentimes, what happens is the government comes along. And you have these high hopes that the government's going to help you. They're going to replace everything you lost. Did you know that in a disaster? How many people know that when a disaster occurs, FEMA will come in and reimburse you for everything and get you back to the way you were before the disaster? Not only back the way you were, but better, right? No, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. You're never going to get restored back to the way you were, even if you had your own life, health, your property insurance. But that's just part of that spiritual impact of disasters. So because, you had this high hopes of things getting better, and now all of a sudden you're saying they're not getting better, this is typically where the instructors will go around and do it, but I'm going to have you turn around to the people behind you and take 2 of their items and throw them on the floor. Yeah, I'll take yours. And you don't read them, you just take them and throw them on the floor. Are these yours? Okay. Okay. Now if we've done this right, everybody should have 4 things in front of them, right? Anybody not have 4 items in front of them?
Well, 3. We don't have anyone.
Well, how did you end up with 3? It was.
She's a bad counter.
I don't know.
I take extra.
You take extra. She's from Washington. All right. Well, you can pick up one or just leave it there. That's fine. Okay. Now what I want you to do is turn those 4 pieces of paper over and see what you have left. Okay, I see a lot of smiles, I'm hearing a lot of laughter, and even on the TV I can see smiles out there from distant sites. How many people are thrilled or happy with the 4 that they've got left? Quite a few of them. How many are sad or feel they lost something really important? Anything really important that you would be willing to share with the group? All her children. She lost all of her children already in this disaster. Your grandchildren.
My family.
Your family and your cat.
My friends are gone.
Your friends are gone. And your what?
My faith.
Your faith. Okay, that's pretty powerful. Okay, does the disaster end here? No. Okay, what happens after, you find out that you're not going to be restored? Then we go, and we'll be talking about this in more detail, we get into what we call the disillusionment stage. And this is why it's so powerful when you're talking about your program resilience with the flood and resilience. This is why pre-education and making sure you have programs that fit the needs of your affected population is not a short-term answer. And you're going to get a lot of funding after a disaster to take care of the short needs. Your needs are going to be more long-term than they are short-term. Because the longer this disaster goes on, the more people are going to realize they've lost, the more challenges they're going to face, the less resources there's going to be, right? And so you really got to be an advocate for long-term, efforts on, especially in emotional health and vibrancy of the community. So what I want you to do, because unless we get you that help, you're going to lose more in your life as time goes on. And so I want you to take a look at your 4 pieces of paper and throw 2 of them away. And if you have 3, then you only can throw 1 away. You're not throwing them on the floor. I see that. There you go. Well, everybody have 2 left? How many's happy with the 2 they've got left in your lives at this point? We got a couple. Getting harder and harder as you're seeing the impact. If we don't take care of our families and our community, what's going to happen? When we look at like suicide rates post-disaster, when do we typically see a high incident, the highest rate or the peaking rate of suicide post-event? What do you think? How many think a year later? How many, what other time period? 6 months later. Okay. Years for flood. Years or year? Years. Yeah. Actually, the peak for suicide post a catastrophic disaster, a flood or any disaster, is 6 to 7 years. And so when we're developing mental health intervention programs or crisis intervention programs, and we're worrying about 6 months, a lot of people think the 1-year anniversary, and we're missing that it's 6 to 7 years out there, then we're missing affecting our population. And when we're looking at losses, we have to look at people other than the people who have lost a house. We have to look at the population at large. And I've been working with a family back home after the flood who is, the marriage has ended now. The person has developed an addiction now. His life pretty much is crapped out, excuse the expression. Do you know what his role was? He turned the gas meters off to the houses. Turn the gas meters off to the houses. Now, if you were taking a poll of people, how many people would even think that somebody who turned the gas off to a house would be so powerfully impacted? Probably most people would not. And that's why when we're looking at programs, we have to say, we got to look at more of the impact of what the community is at large and broaden that out to make sure we're capturing our affected population. When we're doing like aviation disasters and we're bringing in like families from all around the world to gather at to come to the disaster site, we really work hard at identifying who the population needs that needs support. And they include the housekeeping staff of the hotel who goes into their rooms every day to clean up after these families who are gathering in the house, who are hearing stories and seeing things. The bus drivers who are transporting them around. The wait staff in the restaurants who are feeding them and hearing their stories. You know, the security guards out in the post. You know, people that are, you know, most people would say be ancillary, that, you know, they're really not part of the disaster. They are, because they become brought in with the commotion of the disaster. We look at increased domestic violence, substance abuse, behavioral changes, cognitive changes, and this is all reflecting on that spiritual component that I alluded to earlier, that we don't know how to cope with what's happening to us, and as the further we get out, the further our friends and our family say, I'm tired of this. You know, you've just not been the same since that flood or since that disaster, that I can't take it anymore. And you know, if we don't provide support to the families and our staff and our things, that number will continually be staggering. And so now you have two pieces of paper in front of you. And let's say you're not getting that help. So decide which one of those two get thrown away. Now who's happy with what they've got left? And what do you have left, if you're willing to share? Her husband. What?
Self-dignity.
Self-dignity. Yeah, important. Family. You survived with your family. You know, you had mentioned you lost family and faith. You know, it's not unusual when we do this exercise that it's real normal for people who can't throw it on the floor because it's so important. So that's a normal response. And it's also very common to see, especially when we get down to like the last two, where I've actually had people start crying because, you know, it becomes so real, they get so connected to it that they realize this is what's happening to their lives. In situations like yours, where I have participants looking at a piece of paper, and one is their family and one is their God. What do you think, in the majority of times, gets thrown away? How many think God? 9 out of 10 times the family gets thrown away. Right. And why would that be? What I hear from people, and this is a lot of times where the tears come in, is that I love my family very much, but if I throw my God away, I have no belief to hang on to. And if I keep my faith with God, I know I will see my family again. But if I give up my God, then I also give up my family, because I lose the core values of my life and my existence. Yeah, so that's what you did. Yeah. Yeah. Powerful statement. Does that happen in reality? Oh yeah. I've done several disasters, especially the tsunami is one that comes to mind right now, but we see in a lot of different disasters where there's a lot of times flooding, especially, I think, where I'd have women tell me that they were clinging to a tree or clinging to something, and they had a baby in each hand. And they said, you know, I couldn't hold on anymore to them and to the tree. And they said I had to let one of them go. And I had one woman said, I just closed my eyes and I just opened one hand and then saw who I had left. You know, I mean, that's real. That's what our families are going to go through. You know, in 9/11, World Trade Center, all these things, you know, talking about shaking your values to the core as you sit there and watch people jumping out of the upper floors. You know, I was doing counseling a woman one morning that was saying, you know, it was like she hadn't slept in more than a week at that point, and she says, I can't sleep at night. All I can see is people falling like raindrops from the sky in front of me, and I can't sleep. I can't, my whole life is destroyed because all I see are these raindrops of people. So there's such earth-shattering changes of coping mechanisms, these spiritual things that eat away and make, their values, your beliefs, everything that's important is on the floor. And that's more than just the people who are affected. That's happening to the responders. The responders who go out and experience these events and can't get them into a proper perspective. Those are what losses are. I alluded to emotional phases of disaster recovery, and there's really commonly talked about 4 phases: heroic, honeymoon, disillusionment, reconstruction phase. And we kind of talked briefly about it within that exercise. The heroic phase is early on. It's the shock, the fear, the confusion, the adrenaline rush. All the big power of I'm going to save. I'm saving someone. Heroic efforts. The community comes together. I'm sure if in your community has been affected by a disaster, you're just amazed how, people showed up and made things happen to sandbag before, or to pull a child from the river, or, did some act of, some heroic act. What I would contend, and this is what we're teaching out of our center, is that the 4 parts of a disaster, the 4 phases of disaster, have always been kind of geared towards the victim perspective. We contend that not only is it there's a component for the victim, but there's also a component in each of these phases for the workers. And so while this is going on for the victims or survivors of a disaster, this is always also going on in a certain level to the responders. Who are, the police officer, the firefighters going to the scene, to the emergency management who are, going into collapsing structures trying to save lives. The big camaraderie within the staff. But workers also suffer through this heroic phase or experience through this heroic phase the stress of check-in and orientation. Now that may sound trivial, but it's not. When your adrenaline's going full bore, you've come with lights and sirens, or you've flown in from Cedar Rapids to help, and now you're sitting there doing tedious paperwork. Your adrenaline's going like crazy, and your body's trying to sit. You've got this conflict of action going on. Tremendous frustration and anxiety to get started. In hurricane operations, a lot of times organizations will pre-deploy. And a hurricane's coming, it's going to hit this town, so you're putting people like 200 miles away. And they're sitting there, sometimes they're sitting there for a week or 2 weeks before the hurricane hits finally. It stalls out there and changes course. And you've got all these people that for a week or 2 weeks are spending all this huge amount of adrenaline, but going nowhere and doing nothing with it. And they tremendous frustration and anxiety because they can't get going, but once they get going, they can't let down or rest. Then, I'm going 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. Everybody's relying on me. And as management, it's important for us to say, time out here, folks. That's when we get mandatory days off. That's where you work, a certain shift of hours. And if you as a manager doesn't do it, you're not going to get a staff to do it. You lead by example. But you really have to look at how to get your staff to back down and rest and take a breath, because otherwise they're going to expend so much energy in the long run, they're not going to be a value to you. All of a sudden, when they get going so hard, they become identified with the victims. And I'm always amazed in disasters where you've got responders running around, I survived Katrina. You weren't even there for Katrina. How can you survive it? But they make that connection. I survived, Grand Forks flood, or whatever it is. You weren't there for it, but they become so closely identified to the victims. And they oftentimes will talk about, we experienced this or we that. No, it was them that experienced it. You're there as a responder helping them. But it becomes very meshed. And they get so meshed that you see tremendous loyalty to fellow responders, whether they're living or dead. And classic example was 9/11. Here we had this catastrophic incident. You had these 100-plus story buildings come crushing to the ground. I think a total of 7 buildings collapsed in several days, 9/11 and after, right in the World Trade Center complex. But for those, I got there on day 2. I was flown out of a military jet and was attached to Giuliani's staff. I spent 5 weeks there and then went to Washington, was exposed to anthrax in the Hart Senate building. But, in the 5 weeks I was there working World Trade Center, I never saw a desk, a chair, a file cabinet. Now in those mammoth buildings, there were a lot of desks, chairs, and file cabinets. Solid stuff like this that didn't exist. Why in God's name, in a building with a core temperature burning at 3,500 degrees temperature when we cremate at 1,600 degrees, were responders going into a building trying to recover remains or bodies where the core component of a human body is 60–70% water? And it goes right back to, putting your lives at risk because they became so enmeshed, so loyalty, so dedicated. They were risking their lives to go in to rescue people that they knew couldn't exist. If a file cabinet, a chair, or a computer couldn't exist, something made of 60–70% water wasn't going to exist. But they were getting in that building, causing huge health issues and health problems, and risking their lives to do it. And if you remember, it was about 2.5, 3 weeks. There was a big controversy there in the weeks of when do you call it off as a rescue operation, go to recovery operation. And finally, Giuliani came down and said, it is now a recovery operation. And what happened that day, do you remember? Fistfights broke out at Ground Zero between firefighters and police officers and tradesmen, workers down there, because they were damned that they were going to stop rescuing people. There was not going to become a recovery operation. That tells you how desperate that environment was. But again, if you're a management person, that's going to be your job, is to figure out how are you going to save your staff's lives by managing it effectively and making it realistic. If we're looking at an act of terrorism, how are you going to prevent your workers from exposing them to a terrorist situation that's going to put their lives at risk? Chechnya, I think it was a few years ago, terrorists invaded a school and killed students and teachers. Let's say, that's what I see as one of our biggest threats in this country, because if terrorists invade one of our schools, or several schools around the country, kids aren't ever going to go to school again. Parents aren't going to leave their kids, or parents are going to go to work. It'll have a tremendous impact on our population. But imagine if there was a chemical release with terrorists in a school, and fire and police respond, and they know people are dropping dead inside. How are you going to, what are you going to do? They don't have the equipment. They don't know what the agent is. Are they going to go? And who else is going to show up probably faster than the police and the fire? The parents. You're going to have a chaotic event. But, one of the toughest things that it's going to be for the incident commander is says nobody crosses this line. And that may mean watching your children and the teachers die within that building. But unless you have the right equipment, unless you know what's going on, you can't enter that scene. But people are going to put themselves at this risk because, their tremendous loyalty, and because that's what people are doing. But that's part of your management. That's going to be part of your responsibility. And you need to take these seriously as far as what your perception is. I mean, we talked earlier about how many would show up in a true pandemic or biological release, and the survey said in the mid-20s, Chicago. I go back to 1990 when I was called by the military for Operation Desert Storm. It was sitting in my office, and it was about 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I get this phone call and it says, "Is this Peter T?" And I said, "Yeah." And they says, "Well, I'm calling for the United States Army in Germany, and I've got a series of questions to ask you. Are you willing to talk to me?" and I'm thinking, well, I've never been in the military. I usually don't get calls like this, but my curiosity got the better of me. I said, sure. Well, if you answer no to any of these questions, the phone call ends immediately. I said, well, this, you know, it shows you how bright I am. I said, okay, I'll keep, sorry to answer. It was a fascinating discussion because, you know, the gist of it was, you're one of 35 funeral directors hired because your experience, my experience was 232 at that point, to support Operation Desert Storm. You'll be deployed for up to 9 months. You won't be able to tell anybody where you're at or what you're doing. You'll be exposed to nuclear, chemical, and biological agents. We can't guarantee you'll come back alive. You know, painting this really attractive, you know, we want you type wanted poster. And, you know, so it was an incredible discussion of, you know, really bringing it down to earth of, you know, what's going to be your answer. And they wanted an answer within an hour and a half. And so it's, you know, my wife at that time worked with me, and I remember going into the other room and trying to explain to her this conversation. Guys, this is a heads up. I no more got out of my mouth, and I said, what do you think I should do? She immediately said, I think you ought to go. We're no longer married anyway. But it was, you just got it. But we ended, you know, I ended up calling back and saying I would go, and then we were supposed to deploy on Tuesday, and then it delayed, and then it got delayed 3 times. We weren't going to deploy until the ground war started, and then the ground war started and ended right away. But, and thank God we didn't have the death toll that we were going to. But the question, the reality, and since that time, several times I've had to make that decision with my responses, where, you know, you're on call. I was spokesperson for Y2K and, you know, other terrorist threats I knew I would be deployed to, and then 9/11. It's kind of like, what's going to be your answer if you got a phone call like that on Friday afternoon? Because if that's your professional role, and if the hospital calls up or the health department calls up or whatever organization you're with calls up and said, we've just had this happen, we need you to show up to work, we need you to do your job. How are you going to answer that? That's not the time to figure out, well, let me figure out if I can do this, or I've got church on Sunday, or I got, you know, a bake sale tomorrow I'm in charge of. You know, I've got a garage sale going on. You need to decide now what you're going to respond to if you got a phone call like that. Because you need to talk to your families. You need to make your disaster plan. You need to know, you know, how you're going to adjust your life, because people are depending on you to respond. And if you're not going to respond, then let them find somebody who they can rely on to come and help them. And I think that's a tough thing as responders or people in emergency services or people in the caring professions to come up with an honest answer. Because we can all come up with excuses why not to go. The reason is they expect you to go. You've given a promise to respond. Are you going to keep your promise? Because if you don't, how are you going to live with yourself in the long run? The aftermath of those type of losses, by making that decision and not going when that's your professional calling, will haunt you for years to come. The honeymoon phase is attendance of basic needs, chaotic environment, unrealistic optimism, community cohesion. Everybody's coming together. It's a big kumbaya. Boy, we're going to be better than before. And, you know, look at all the millions of dollars that are coming in from all people. All these hundreds of volunteers who are coming in to help us. You know, it's wonderful. Well, you'll see that doesn't last long. You've already seen that. But this is a best phase for a disaster, because, you know, everything just is clicking, and you're making tremendous success, and people who didn't talk to each other are talking to each other now. But the workers are experiencing all that kumbaya stuff, but they're also being challenged by long hours, many days, constant exposure in the sense of I'm okay. And when I have, as a management person on disaster response, when I have staff telling me I'm okay, I really get worried. Because I want them to tell me, I'm having a crappy day today. I couldn't go to sleep last night. You know, I went home and I cried last night. I'd rather hear that than have them constantly tell me day in and day out that I'm okay. Because then at least I know that where they're at emotionally and we can address that issue. But if they're not willing to admit to themselves where they're at, you know, it's hard to get the help to them to make them a better responder. And I'm as guilty as that as the next person. You know, I'm writing a book. A book's due out at the end of the year. And I was writing this part of this chapter last night. But I remember in 9/11, you know, we were working 20 hours a day, exposed to a horrific environment, exposed to visual, auditory, all that stuff coming at us. But we were telling people we're okay. Where I was working, because I was part of the command leadership staff, when our building, we had officers on the inside with Uzis. We had Marines on the outside in bunkers with 50 caliber machine guns. Red Cross headquarters had Marines around them or Army with machine guns in front of Red Cross headquarters. Our workplace with emergency management had terrorist threats against it all the time. Because of my security clearance, I could take a car wherever I went. But wherever you went, they checked to make sure a bomb wasn't attached to it. Even at the hotel, I couldn't go home at night, go in the hotel parking lot until security checked it for a bomb. I mean, it's like Fargo and Cedar Rapids. We don't have a lot of big worry about people attaching bombs to your cars. But there's this insidiousness that goes with that. But I was okay. I remember about week 3 into the operation, I had friends who had just finished the Pentagon operation. They were going to come up and visit our site, see what was going on in New York. And we had got put on alert for the next day. And I remember calling them up and saying, I don't want you to come tomorrow because we've just been put on another terrorist alert, and I think I'm going to die tomorrow, and I don't want you to die with me. Wow. And yet I was okay. And that's how insidious this stuff gets. You know, the one person said, I ain't coming. And the other person said, I'm coming anyway. But, you know, that's where, you know, I teach this stuff. You know, I develop programs around the world for this stuff. And I've 45 disasters, whatever. I mean, and so when people say, oh, this stuff doesn't bother you, I'm saying, you know, it will at some point. You know, it depends on how full your garbage can is. But at some point, you're not going to be able to constantly go through this stuff without being able to taking good care of yourself and making sure your staff is taking good care of themselves. Disillusionment phase, we all have sensed that, I'm sure, with the different disasters. You know, family, community politics emerge. You see a lot of grieving. You see a traumatic increase in family stress, domestic violence, substance abuse. People using inappropriate ways to manage their stress, which we'll talk about briefly. But this is where it just starts crashing down around you. And, you know, this can be weeks or even months later as people realize their lives aren't going to get back to where they were. Workers will experience a lot of those same things, but they're also going to be overwhelmed by the losses. They're also going to be overwhelmed by the negativity that's coming out. Now the families are feeling the grief and the loss. They want to vent their anger on someone, and a lot of times they'll vent their anger on the responders, the people who are trying to help them. You know, they'll lie, you lied to me, you cheated me, you told me the wrong thing. They turn against the people who are trying to help them. And that becomes a very difficult challenge for people who are already being overwhelmed, probably sleep deprived, you know, hearing story after story. You know, you just become this big sponge that I mentioned earlier that just starts soaking up everyone's story. And all of a sudden, if you're somebody who's rotated in, it's time to start rotating out. And after so many weeks and you're starting to rotate staff turnover gets to be very conflicting time period. Because you've got the people that have been here that are simply exhausted, wiped out, can't take anymore. and you've got the smiley, bouncing gal that just gets off the airplane that is, has a wand. One gal showed up with a fairy wand because she was going to sprinkle fairy dust over everybody to make them happy. You just wanted to punch her out, But you've got a conflict of, opportunities going there because she's way back in the heroic stage and you're way up here in the disillusionment stage. And it's like putting oil and water together, in the same office and transition. Or someone would come in and say, well, I would have never done it that way. You should have done it this way. Well, then you should have been here on day one when we didn't have anything to do it that way. But as management people, that becomes a very difficult time to merge staff. And that can be staggering all the way along because, this rollover, constant change of personnel or assignments is an ongoing event, not just something that happens once. You may have staff rotating every day coming as a constant reminder of how inept you are because they're telling you how much better they would have done it. Reconstruction phase, that's a building light at the end of the tunnel, starting to put their life behind them, return to pre-disaster activities. This is months, even perhaps years later for the family, the victims. On the other hand, the workers are left with the follow-up. They're the ones that are going to start going home. They're feeling good about it. They're trying to reorientate themselves back to going home. But a lot of problems is the letdown. They can't let down. There's a sense of loss, of guilt of not doing it enough, a guilt of leaving their comrades back, the families they're serving, what's going to happen to them, I was taking care of them. And they have a real problem going home and starting to re-engage with their family. And I was talking to, I think on a break with someone of, if this is, I've always tried to talk to what we call newbies, so the first time out disaster people, is that, you're coming with this mindset. You've got to realize that you will go home a different person, especially in these huge catastrophic disasters. And if you're going to think you're going to go home and not be untouched by it, you're probably not being honest with yourself. And again, what kind of support system we have for their family, what kind of things so that we can reengage. It will take sometime weeks, months, or years for a responder to get re-engaged back in a normal lifespan. We still have people from 1989 United Flight 232 who were never able to go back to the work that they did it before the crash, who have never been able to return back to their work environment because of what they experienced in 1989. And so it's, it is just a very powerful thing, life-changing, spiritual thing that we have to help people refocus on. Critical incident is an event that has the potential to create significant human distress that can overwhelm one's usual coping mechanism. So this is kind of just a term. A critical incident is something that's sudden onset, very powerful, and can be very overwhelming. It's not, a critical incident is not having someone who is diagnosed with cancer and has died after a year of fighting cancer. That's a grieving, it's a sorrowful thing, but it's not a critical incident. Crisis is a temporary disruption, which kind of throws off your balance, your psychological balance. What we look at in disaster response is more the psychological crisis, which is an acute response to trauma, and you have to have all three of these points involved to really meet the definition of a psychological crisis. It knocks your balance is disruptive, your coping mechanisms have failed, and there's evidence of significant impairment. And that's really, from a mental health component or a crisis intervention component, that's really what we look at as the key focus of wanting to make sure that we've got the help in the system, short-term and long-term out there. Increased risk factors for psychological impairment are disasters that are rapid, intentional, like a terrorist act, incidents that involve children, the number and condition of the fatalities. If you have 100 dead and they're all intact, sitting in a room, and something happened, they all drop over, that's one thing. To have them exploded into thousands of fragmented pieces, and the detail and the blood and the gore and the dismemberments that's involved, that will have a different type of stimuli to the people as impact on people. What kind of media attention is the event getting? is giving the coverage, and are they representing you well? I mean, if they're talking about how wonderful your response is, that's one thing. But if you're trying to be the responder and the media is attacking you and saying, they're really doing a crummy job, you know, these people died because the responders didn't do what they were supposed to, you know, that can really hone in and bring a spotlight to your response that can be a negative impact. I say that, but I also say that we would not have a disaster if it wasn't for the media. And, you know, a lot of people will laugh at that. This class didn't, so I tell them we're getting close to time. But that is really a compliment to the media. And that is why in your planning and when you're having your meetings, you need to invite the media to them. They need to be active participants in what you're trying to accomplish. Because, you know, you would have never heard about Haiti if it wasn't for the media. You wouldn't have heard about 9/11 right away if it wasn't for the media. You wouldn't know how to respond if it wasn't the media telling you how to respond or be safe. The media is a critical part of your planning and response in your program. Without it, you're not going to get the message out. So you need to get them involved. Increase risk factors for psychological impact is if you personalize it and become, like we said, loyalty to, you know, extreme loyalty to your families. If you're involved with handling remains or personal effects, you know, what kind of responder issues? Do you have a strong support system for your responders? Do they have the equipment that they need? Do they know that they're being protected? When we got to ground zero, I couldn't see from here to the stairway. There was so much debris in the air. And yet we had no hard hats. If you wanted a hard hat, you had to wait till someone came out with one and grab one from them to go in. We had no respirators, no face masks, no goggles. And we didn't have that. We finally started getting respirators 5 weeks later. And so those of us who work at World Trade Center are now on every year, I'm going through right now, an extremely comprehensive physical exam. Because we got workers who are dying. We have workers whose lungs are failing. You have cancer being developed from all the stuff that we inhaled and ingested working ground zero. And so there's this federal health study going on. And it's in 3 phases. Every year we go through it. And we got done with phase 2 last week. Just trying to figure out. But, you know, what are the responder issues? If you're killing me out there because I don't have the equipment I need, that's going to have a dramatic impact. Response to aspects of trauma, a threat to your life will increase anxiety, hyperarousal, loss of death of a loved one, of course, is grief. Horror is a lot of intrusive thoughts and intrusions. And a bad outcome gives you guilt, a sense that you failed. And you failed the community, you failed the people. Your whole profession was designed around helping. I don't have time for this video, so we're going to flip through here. I want to get into some statistics, give you an idea of what happens. Post-Oklahoma City, 25 to 30% increase in divorce rate in the Oklahoma City Police Department. We're over 300% increase in the divorce rate in the fire department. Why do you think the difference? Rescuers what? Yeah, their exposure to the risk and the stress levels. For the most part, it was the fire department that was working in the building. And so you had a building that was terribly unstable. You had what they call the mother lode, which was a big floor that was, if you remember the pictures, there was a big concrete slab that was just dangling there. They cabled it up to keep it from falling. But you had firefighters in the building who were digging through the rubbles trying to find the dead. That building was so unstable that on the day of the event, the day of the memorial service, they actually had 3 dead bodies in the corner of the building buried in the rubble that they couldn't recover because it was that pile of rubble that was keeping the building up. And if they dug down to get the bodies out, there was nothing to keep the building up. On the day of the memorial service, we had families down there from 1 o'clock to 7 o'clock. We had a massive thunderstorm headed, we thought, directly to downtown Oklahoma City. We had to postpone the memorial service. It was a site visit, people going down the site, because if that thunderstorm came, the winds of that thunderstorm could topple that building. They had a laser beam on the corner of the building and this is before the memorial service, but watching, see how much the building was swaying? That building was swaying 15 feet in either direction. And yet you had firefighters inside trying to uncover the dead. So their exposure to stress was much higher than the police officers sitting out on the perimeter, watching the barricades or manning security. Increase in suicide, I say greater than suicides because, well, I haven't seen any current numbers, but I've just heard again somebody just recently that was killed, who died, committed suicide, and that's Captain Chris Fields, who is immortalized in this photograph. Critical incident stress management teams were on site. They brought in professionals from around the country, and there are long-term programs that are being funded to maintain. Right. But this is Captain Chris Fields, who we saw, of course, carrying the dead child of Bailey Allman. You know, that became the photograph of Oklahoma City. And he recently committed suicide because he was racked with grief and depression of his work and how he was an active part of that response. We know in studies from first responders, the first responder study, it came out in 2003 post 9/11. When we look at all sites, World Trade Center, Shanksville, and Pentagon, the personnel that were interviewed were there, but you see 82% response rate, which is pretty incredible for any type of survey. But what they found in the first study is 14 to 35% of the responders had moderate to extreme post-traumatic stress disorder, indicating these indicators, from disturbed dreams, feeling numb, upset when reminded. 10 to 30% had health problems, new or worsened, from sleep, anxious, upset, coughing, and 18 to 24% had problems functioning. Now, looking at those staggering numbers, knowing that these are a lot of police and fire, emergency responders, and you're saying we have these guys on the street in these conditions, you know, that becomes a danger. I mean, that's the reality of it. I mean, that's why we have to make sure we have good behavioral services available to them to deal with their cognitive, their emotional, their physical, all their spiritual aspect to help them gain past. Now, we know that statistically, Diane Myers, who I mentioned in her research, came out, she and David Wee came out, that in a catastrophic disaster, 50% of your responders will suffer from post-traumatic stress, which is a disruption of their normal life functions and capabilities that will last up to, but usually diminishes by 6 months. 50% of the workforce. Well, that means the disaster is over with, they're still back on the street, they're still in the hospital, they're still doing their job, and they're not functioning at a full level of strength of what they need to do their job. That puts them at risk, it puts their patients at risk, it puts the people they're serving at risk. In the program I did for the National Guard, I had a police officer who was an MP over in Iraq. And he said, you know, he says, I can't get engaged anymore. I am totally numb from the horrors I dealt over there. He said, I'm back on patrol here in my city here in Iowa. And he says, I used to have fun throwing my siren on and racing to a scene and getting involved. That's where I got my reward for being my work. He says, you know how I get it now? He said, while I'm on duty, I pray for a domestic violence call because I'm hoping I go out and get to beat the hell out of somebody. You know, but that's why those are how these things will impact. Now, will that inflict somebody outside the family? Possibly, but it also increases on domestic violence calls and increase on the impacts. I'm going to flip. You have these numbers in your slides. Well, I won't spend a lot of time on them. But we know the psychological impact from members of this athletic and working health force, it's having a tremendous impact on them because they're less healthy. They're a lot of ailments, long-term impact on their lives. I'm looking for, and these are just statistics and numbers that you have there. Most vulnerable to PTSD equals those who are highly exposed. Those of us started work sooner after 9/11, worked longer periods of time, or worked at the site for quite a while. The good thing about 9/11, will be interesting, I don't know if it's a good thing, but the thing about 9/11 is it'll be a fascinating long-term stay between police and fire. Police came out with strong critical incident stress support. They required all the police officers and all the members of the police force to go through crisis intervention, debriefings, and other services. It was required. And they brought in trained people from all over the country to do it for months afterwards. Fire said, we don't need that, and didn't offer the same services. What they ended up doing, I think, was offering 1 to 3 mental health sessions for firefighters. Now, looking at that number earlier between Oklahoma City, between police and fire, you're saying fire really needs it up front. Here they're saying we get 3 sessions. And there's a sense of intimidation was at the time by the fire department. We have one of our instructors was a deputy chief, head of EMS, was setting up triage at the base of the World Trade Center when it started to collapse. And he recounts that he was standing there at the base of the tower with his 2 other deputies, and they were setting up triage. When they realized the building was coming down, he said, the 3 of us are standing there, we looked at each other, and we all screamed at each other, run. He says, my 2 buddies took off in one direction, and he said, I stopped in my tracks, and I heard my wife say, don't go that way. And he says, I turned around and ran the opposite direction. He says, I'm running in this debris. He says, I can't see anything. I'm totally blind. My wife is telling me where to go, and she's directing me into an underground garage where we were buried until we were able to dig ourselves out. Now, this was the last time this story, we were recounting this like April after that September attack. We were in Arizona teaching. And he said, I couldn't see. I didn't know what was happening. I just listened to my wife. And she says, I'm alive today because my wife took care of me, because she said our kids wouldn't be orphaned. She said, my wife died a year before 9/11. But she was there and telling me what to do. And as we were doing class, he got a phone call, and you could just see his body change. And he said, thank God. And he had gotten word at that moment that his 2 buddies had just been identified. He said, all of this, and I get 3 counseling sessions. He said, I am in counseling. My kids are in counseling. I have to keep it secret from the department because it will affect my promotions. He said, I'm afraid they're going to find out. But he said, my family's falling apart, and all I got was 3 counseling sessions. That's not the kind of support program these folks need in a short-term or long-term instance. Here's the quote from Diane and them. We'll look at stress. What's the most addictive drug? And this is an important thing for us to deal with. The most addictive drug is adrenaline. And getting people charged up on adrenaline and just letting them go rampant with it. That's part of the management team, is helping them to control adrenaline, help them to manage it, help them to allow their feelings to get vented out in things that are not destructive to them. That, you have a vibrant workforce during the response, after the response, and you have community members that are being cared for. Many of the emotional reactions of a disaster stem from working with problems in the afterwards. We all laughed when we said federal government isn't going to restore you. The bureaucracy, the not being able to get contractors in, people to listen to your story, all has a tremendous impact afterwards. And that's why those pieces of paper you're throwing away went on for months and years afterwards, because for her, it's not going to end now that her house is gone. And most people just don't see themselves needing mental health services. They will fight you on it. I don't need it. I'm okay. Get away from me, But statistics are just showing that's just not true. Here's how we display symptoms of crisis, personally, from anxiety, sleep, fatigue, things that we saw in the report from the first responder report. And here's how many people medicate themselves, from stimulants I never figured, chocolate between cocaine and nicotine seems a little unfair. But, failure to sleep, eating too much, not eating enough, sex. You'll have somebody who's very, very faithful to the wife for years or to the husband for years, and all of a sudden they become a bunny rabbit. And it's just a different in characteristics. They go shop, they gamble. So what you need to do when we're working as a management team looking at our staff is trying to figure out a baseline. Where's the baseline? How do they deviate from the baseline? Because maybe the person acted like a bunny rabbit before the disaster. And so now if they're not acting like a bunny rabbit afterwards, that's a deviant problem. There's a problem. If they gambled before and they're gambling afterwards, but they're gambling the same amount of limit, it's not necessarily reflective of a problem. So you're trying to figure out, as they're doing this, where are they from deviating from what their norm is, not from your norm. And we're looking at crisis intervention, focusing on emotional first aid. So whatever program we have when we're doing crisis intervention, it's dealing with the problem related to this disaster response. I'm sorry you didn't have a nice childhood, but that's not what we're dealing with. Crisis intervention following a disaster is part of a continuum of care. And we're looking at a piece up at the beginning of caring for the workers and the families. At some point, you elevate that person, if needed, to higher levels of care, to licensed mental health, to maybe institutional care, maybe to drugs if need be. But what your programs need is making sure that in this crisis timeline that we're looking at, defining what your program is going to fit, so it doesn't get too big, but that it is integrated into the overall system. They can't, each of these can't stand alone. They all have to be together in partnership. You have to bring your mental health agencies together and figure out how you're going to do it. And I'm sorry, but we're just flat out of time here. Quickly here, I want to catch, when you're developing a program, make sure it fits your population. Make sure it's usable, that you're not needing a lot of on-site support, that it is adapted to the population you're serving. It needs to be simple. It needs to be something that's brief. The more complicated you get it, the more difficult it's going to be. I remember one disaster a few years ago, a tornado went through a heavily area of Iowa that was just agricultural area. You got a lot of mental health people, crisis intervention people coming out there going to help the farmers. Excuse me, Iowa farmers, probably North Dakota farmers, aren't going to talk to you unless you're a farmer. So the problem is, okay, how do we help the farmers? We went to the churches of that community and we found a bunch of retired farmers. We brought them in, had the mental health people come in and teach them how to do crisis intervention, and sent the retired farmers with coolers with stuff that farmers like, from chew and everything else, whatever they like, beef jerky, and we sent these old retired farmers out who then took care of the farmers out there. And then they came back and reported, and they went back out and with 8 tools we gave them. Think of how you're going to address the population, and just don't try to make it fit within your confines. You're going to have to think out of the box to take care of the population you're dealing with. You've got the rest of the notes. If you've got any questions, feel free. Thank you very much. You were a great class.